You know that feeling when a place seems quiet for too long and the silence itself starts watching you back? Some houses don't hide secrets. They breathe them. This is We Have Always Lived in the Castle, Shirley Jackson's haunting final novel, a story born from shadows she knew intimately. Jackson carried her own fears, isolation and fascination with the cruelty that can live beneath ordinary faces, and she poured that unease into something that felt less like fiction and more like a dream you can't wake from. When it arrived in 1962, few could have known that its strange heartbeat would echo across generations and quietly reach millions of readers around the world. By then, Jackson had already become a legend through works like The Lottery and The Haunting of Hill House, mastering the art of making everyday life feel deeply unsettling. Its dark pull eventually found its way to the screen with a film adaptation in 2018, but tonight, you're stepping into the story in a different way. This is a third-person retelling, not a word-for-word reading, and as you follow these halls and locked doors, remember this. The visuals in this video are created using today's technology. They may not always perfectly match every scene from the story, but they are designed to help you visualize the world and atmosphere as you listen. Stay close, because later, hidden beneath the story, you'll uncover fascinating facts, adaptation secrets, and the strange details behind how this unsettling world came to life. Now the gates are opening, and you are already too close to turn back. The story begins. The world belonged to Mary Catherine Blackwood, a girl of 18 with an oddity on both hands, her two middle fingers matching in length, a deformity she secretly felt might have qualified her for something wilder than this life. She lived with her sister Constance in a house of precise order, a dwelling layered with generations of Blackwood possessions that kept it anchored. Everyone else in that lineage was gone. She recalled the library books still sitting on the kitchen shelf, 5 months past their due date. They had arrived one Friday in late April, and she sometimes wondered if she would have chosen differently had she known these volumes would be the last to ever come through that door. In their house, motion was rare. Only small, surface objects like books and spoons shifted underneath. Everything stayed. They dusted around things but never truly moved them, leaving her mother's tortoiseshell set perfectly aligned on the dressing table. That was how Blackwoods lived, accumulating possessions until the weight of them steadied the house against the outside. Tuesdays and Fridays were her burdens, the days she must venture into the village for food and library books. Constance never stepped past her own garden, and Uncle Julian was incapable of the journey, so the task fell to Mary Catherine. She told herself it was sheer necessity, not pride that sent her, yet she always stopped at Stella's for coffee, and she recognized that as pure arrogance, an insistence that she would not be seen as afraid by the woman behind the counter, even as she longed to be home. Stella would greet her with the same ritual questions, and Mary Catherine would answer with measured politeness, accepting only black coffee because she was here only out of defiance. If anyone else entered, she would slip away without haste, nodding goodbye, hearing Stella's automatic farewell trail after her. She chose her reading carefully. Their father's study held books enough, but Mary Catherine preferred fairy tales and history's Constance favored cookbooks. Uncle Julian never read himself but enjoyed watching Constance with a book, occasionally asking what she was studying and expressing approval at the sight. Yet those final library books had never been opened. They remained untouched on the shelf. On that April morning, emerging from the library into deceptive spring sunshine, she paused on the steps to gaze at the faint green stirring in the branches, wishing she could simply walk home through the sky instead of navigating the village streets. She mapped her route with the wariness of a board game. Every move carried risk or advantage. Crossing directly meant passing the general store with its loitering men, whose youth seemed frozen while their women aged with weary malice. The safer path, the one she chose, took her past the post office, and the crumbling Rochester house, her mother's birthplace, now a junkyard possessed by the Harlers, who seemed to cherish every piece of rusted debris. The Rochester house, once elegant with its walnut library and ballroom and rose-covered veranda, should have been Constance's by right. Mary Catherine averted her eyes from it, unable to bear the thought of her mother's origins there. The street was quiet this morning, but she knew the grocery route would inevitably bring her back past the general store, and enduring that twice was unthinkable. Beyond the village, the wealthy Clarks and Carringtons had built modern homes, yet they still passed through this squalor to reach them. The villagers, living in their shabby houses, would smile and wave at these newcomers, even as Helen Clark picked up forgotten groceries. They would wish her good morning and comment on the weather. Yet the Blackwood house was finer than the Clarks, and the Blackwood land stretched between highway and river. The town hall, a white-pillared gift from the Shepherds, stood as a monument to class, but the villagers outvoted the gentry each year on zoning laws, preserving their shacks and benches. Beyond the town hall, Blackwood Road curved around the family property, every inch lined with the wire fence their father had built. Near the big black rock, Mary Catherine would unlock the gate and secure it behind her, stepping into the woods that led home. The villagers had always hated them. She knew this. She turned the shopping trip into a game, visualizing a board with squares marking danger and reward. The library was her starting point. The Black Rock, victory. She had begun well on the empty side of Main Street, perhaps a good day in the making, and on very good days, she would later leave an offering of jewelry in gratitude. She walked briskly, carrying books and shopping bag, watching her feet in their mother's old brown shoes move one after the other. The post office watcher, old Miss Dutton, who never stared openly but only through blinds, sent a prickle across her skin. But Mary Catherine could bear it. She would not look at the Rochester house, could not stomach the thought of her mother born there. She imagined the Harlers inside their wreckage, perhaps believing their din drove away demons, eating off broken plates on the skeleton of a Ford, a spray of dirt always spreading across their sidewalk. The next move in Mary Catherine's game was the most exposed, crossing the street to reach the grocery opposite. She would hesitate at the curb, feeling vulnerable as traffic rolled past. Most vehicles were simply passing through, their drivers barely registering her presence. But local cars were different. She could always spot them by that quick, ugly glance from behind the wheel, and she found herself wondering what might happen if she stepped off the curb at just the wrong moment. Would there be a deliberate swerve, just enough to startle her, to make her jump? She could already imagine the laughter erupting from every direction, from behind the post office blinds, from the men lounging at the general store, from the women hovering in the grocery doorway. The whole village, watching and gloating at Mary Catherine Blackwood scrambling out of a car's path. She sometimes lost 2 or 3 turns waiting for the road to clear completely before daring to cross. Midway across, she stepped out of shadow and into April's deceptive brightness. By July, the asphalt would soften, and her feet would stick dangerously. She pictured herself trapped in the tar, cringing as a vehicle bore down, forced to retreat all the way to start over. The buildings themselves seemed to grow uglier in that light. The entire village felt of one piece, as though its inhabitants fed on its drabness, needed it. The structures appeared thrown up in contemptuous haste, shelter for the gray and unpleasant, while finer houses like the Rochester place and her own Blackwood home, even the white town hall, seemed to have been transported here by accident from some graceful country, now held prisoner, their slow decay mirroring the villagers' ugliness. The row of stores along Main Street was unchangingly gray, and the apartments above them showed pale, lifeless curtains. Anything colorful soon lost heart here. The blight had never come from the Blackwoods. The villagers belonged to this place, and it belonged to them. She always thought of rot when she approached these stores, burning black rot that consumed from within. She wished it on them all. The grocery list was in her hand, carefully written by Constance each Tuesday and Friday. The villagers resented that the Blackwoods always had money to pay for what they wanted. They whispered about hidden treasures, imagining the 3 of them sitting in the evenings counting golden coins behind locked doors. She could picture their covetous, rotting hearts, but they were cowards, afraid of Blackwoods. She made sure to take out her purse along with the list, so Albert would see she had brought money and couldn't refuse her service. It never mattered who else was in the store. She was always served immediately, with Mr. Elbert or his pale wife rushing over. Once, their older son had been helping during school vacation, and they made sure he wasn't the one to wait on her. Another time, a child clearly a stranger to the village had wandered too close, and Mrs. Elbert had yanked her back so roughly that the girl screamed, followed by a long, frozen silence. Mary Catherine stood rigid when children approached, afraid they might touch her, and that their mothers would descend like taloned hawks. Today, relief washed over her. No children in the store, and few women. A good turn. She greeted Mr. Elbert politely, and he nodded back. He couldn't entirely ignore her, though the women present watched closely. She turned her back on them, but she could feel them there, frozen in place, unwilling to move until she had left. Mrs. Donnell lurked somewhere behind her, always seeking an opportunity to speak, one of the few who dared. She placed her order methodically, a roasting chicken, a leg of lamb for Uncle Julian. She regretted mentioning him, hearing the gasp ripple through the store like a scream. She could make them scatter like rabbits if she chose, but they'd only gather again outside. Onions, coffee, bread, flour, walnuts, sugar. A horrified laugh escaped from behind her. Mrs. Elbert would bring the wrapped meat soon. Mary Catherine didn't need to turn around until she was ready to leave. Milk, cream, butter. The Harrises had stopped delivering 6 years ago, so she carried these home now. Eggs, which Constance had forgotten to list. There were only 2 left at home, and peanut brittle for Uncle Julian to crunch over his papers tonight and go to bed sticky. Mrs. Donnell's voice cut through the silence, observing that the Blackwoods always set a fine table. Someone giggled. Someone else shushed. Mary Catherine didn't turn. It was enough to feel them all behind her, their flat grave faces with hating eyes. She wished them dead, longed to say it aloud. Constance had always warned her never to let them see she cared, that paying attention only made things worse. But Mary Catherine wished them all dead anyway. Imagined walking into the grocery one morning to find them lying there, crying in their death throes. She would step over their bodies, help herself to whatever she wanted, maybe kick Mrs. Donnell on her way out. She felt no remorse for such thoughts. She only wished they would come true. Mr. Elbert totaled her purchases, passing her the slip without meeting her eyes. She always checked his arithmetic carefully, even though he never made mistakes. It was one of the few small retaliations available to her. Her shopping bag overflowed, another bag besides, and she would have to carry it all herself. No one would offer to help, even if she'd accept. Lose 2 turns. Now she had to walk slowly past the general store toward Stella's, her arms laden. She paused in the grocery doorway, searching inside herself for something to cling to. Behind her, the rustling and coughing began as they prepared to talk again, the Elberts probably rolling their eyes in relief. She hardened her face, fixed her mind on a vision lunch in the garden, a green cloth, yellow dishes, strawberries in a white bowl. She walked on, seeing only her mother's brown shoes moving in and out, while in her thoughts she set the table, Uncle Julian getting a soft egg with toast, and she'd remember to ask Constance for a shawl across his shoulders. She could feel their grins and gestures without looking, wish them all dead beneath her feet. They rarely spoke directly to her, only to each other, mocking voices calling her one of the Blackwood girls, pitying them, eyeing the locked-up land. A man could get rich farming Blackwood land, they said, if he had 1,000,000 years and didn't care what grew. She walked on their bodies. Lunch in the garden, Uncle Julian with a shawl. She clutched her groceries tightly, remembering another morning when she'd dropped the bag, spilling eggs and milk while they shouted, and she'd gathered everything up without running, telling herself not to run. Ahead lay the familiar crack in the sidewalk in front of Stella's, shaped like a pointing finger. It had always been there, as old as the village itself. She remembered roller skating across it, avoiding it to protect her mother's back, riding her bicycle past with her hair flying. The villagers hadn't openly hated them then, though her father called them trash. Her mother had told her the crack was there even in her girlhood at the Rochester house, and Mary Catherine supposed it had been there from the beginning, when the gray wood was first assembled, and the ugly people with their evil faces were brought from somewhere impossible and set down in these houses to live. Stella's had barely changed in Mary Catherine's memory, only the coffee urn and marble counter, bought with insurance money after Stella's husband died. She and Constance used to come here after school, spending pennies and picking up the evening newspaper for their father. They no longer bought papers, but Stella still sold them, along with magazines, penny candy, and gray postcards of the town hall. Mary Catherine settled onto a stool, setting her groceries on the floor, and received Stella's familiar greeting. She answered the ritual questions about herself, Constance and Uncle Julian, with practiced brevity, ordering black coffee, though she secretly preferred it sweetened, but she was here only out of pride, and pride demanded she accept the barest minimum. Then a shadow crossed the doorway. Stella moved to the far end of the counter, clearly hoping the newcomer would sit there so Mary Catherine could slip out unnoticed. But it was Jim Donnell, and she knew immediately that this was bad luck. Some villagers, she could hate individually, Jim and his wife were among them, their cruelty deliberate rather than habitual. Jim didn't stay at the far end. He came directly to the stool beside her, as close as possible, deliberately making this morning worse. He announced that he'd heard she and Constance were moving away. She denied it flatly. He pressed, pretending confusion about where the rumor had started. Stella tried to intervene, offering him coffee, shaking her head at him but almost smiling. Mary Catherine noticed her hands tearing at a paper napkin and forced them still, making a mental rule every time she saw a scrap of paper. She would remember to be kinder to Uncle Julian. Jim persisted, circling back to the gossip, suggesting the town would lose one of its fine old families, though he couldn't resist pointing out that many Blackwoods were already gone. He laughed at his own words. Stella told him to stop, but he kept on, blocking Mary Catherine's exit with his legs stretched out, repeating his observations as if wringing each dry. She retreated into herself, imagining a little house on the moon. When Dunham the carpenter entered, Jim drew him into the conversation, recounting that the Blackwoods were supposedly moving, though Mary Catherine had just denied it. Dunham scowled, processing the words slowly. Jim elaborated about the family's private estate, their fences, their stylish way of living, working himself up with each repetition. Mary Catherine made another rule: never think anything more than once. Jim mentioned he could always tell people he'd known the Blackwoods, though he'd never been invited to dinner. Stella sharpened her voice, telling him to pick on someone else. Dunham chimed in about the broken step he'd fixed, and never been paid for a grievance. Mary Catherine remembered clearly how Constance had sent her to refuse payment for a crooked board nailed across the step, and Dunham had spat, pried it loose, thrown it on the ground, and told them to do it themselves. Jim and Dunham laughed together, Dunham declining any future dinner invitations. Stella finally told Mary Catherine to go home, that there'd be no peace until she left. Jim moved his legs just enough to let her pass, mocking her with the nickname Maricat, and offering to help her pack. Dunham started to add something, but Mary Catherine hurried outside, the laughter of the two men and Stella following her. She retreated into her moon house again, furnishing it with a fireplace, a blue exterior, and a garden she'd have to ask Constance what would grow there. She watched her small brown feet moving, the shopping bag swinging at her side. Now she only had to pass the town hall, filled with bureaucrats who wouldn't bother her unless she fished out of season. She imagined catching scarlet fish in the rivers of the moon. Then she spotted the Harris boys in their front yard with half a dozen others. She could have turned back, taken the long way around through the creek, but it was late, and she had groceries, and the creek would ruin their mother's shoes. She walked quickly, thinking of them rotting in pain, doubled up on the ground before her. They saw her immediately, calling out, "Maricat!" in a chorus, lining up along the fence. She held herself steady, pretending she lived on the moon, hearing their chant about tea and poison, a rhyme they'd been taught. She was certain, by their parents who drilled them in cruelty. She wished them all dead on the ground. Mary Catherine found herself wondering whether the village children had been deliberately trained by their parents, Jim Donnell and Dunham, and the Harrises leading regular drills, teaching them with loving precision. How else could so many children have learned their cruel rhymes so thoroughly? L The chant echoed in her mind, a mockery of Constance offering tea, of poison, of a grave 10 feet deep. She pretended not to understand their language, retreating into the soft, liquid tongue of the moon where she sang in starlight, and looked down on the dead, dried world. She was nearly halfway past the fence now, walking steadily, rigidly, placing her feet strongly but without haste. Inside herself she felt strange, hiding very far within, while still aware of their eyes on her, their voices calling. She wished them dead on the ground. She remembered a past encounter when the Harris boy's mother had come onto the porch, watching and listening. Mary Catherine had stopped and looked into her flat, dull eyes, knowing she shouldn't speak, but unable to stop herself, asking why the woman couldn't make them stop. The mother had only told the children not to call the lady names, in a tone of dull enjoyment, and they'd soberly agreed, then shrieked and shouted as Mary Catherine walked on, while the woman stood on the porch laughing. Their tongues would burn, Mary Catherine thought, as if they'd eaten fire. Their throats would sear with every word, their bellies feel torment hotter than 1,000 fires. As she reached the end of the fence, they called their final mocking goodbyes. "Don't hurry back. Give our love to Connie," but she had reached the black rock and the gate to her path. She set down her shopping bag to work the padlock. It was a simple lock, easily broken, but the sign reading "Private No Trespassing" held a power of its own. Her father had erected these barriers when he closed off the path, which had once served as a shortcut for villagers, saving a quarter-mile between the highway and the bus stop. Her mother couldn't bear anyone walking past the front door, so one of the first things her father did when he brought her to the Blackwood house was to fence in the entire property, from highway to creek. Another gate stood at the far end, equally padlocked and signed. "The highway's built for common people," their mother had said, "and my front door's private." Proper visitors came up the main driveway from the highway. As a child, Mary Catherine had lain in her back bedroom, imagining the driveway and path as a crossroads. Before the front door, up and down the driveway, went the good, clean, rich people in satin and lace, while along the path sneaked the villagers, servile and weaving. They couldn't ever get in, she told herself in the dark room with tree shadows patterning the ceiling. The path was closed forever. She sometimes stood inside the fence, hidden in bushes, watching people walk the highway between village and Four Corners. But as far as she knew, no one had tried the path since her father locked the gates. She moved the shopping bag inside, then carefully locked and tested the padlock. Once it held securely behind her, she was safe. The path was dark, overgrown with trees and bushes her father had let run wild when he gave up making the land profitable. No one knew its secret ways but her. She knew every step, every turn. Constance could name every growing thing, but Mary Catherine knew them by their place and purpose, by the refuge they offered. The only prints on the path were her own, except sometimes, past the turn, she might find a mark of Constance's foot, where she had come to wait. Today she saw Constance as soon as she rounded the turn, standing at the garden's end with the house behind her, bathed in sunlight. Mary Catherine ran to meet her. Constance smiled and pointed out how far she had come. Mary Catherine warned her not to go too far, afraid she might follow into the village. Constance teased that she might, and Mary Catherine felt a chill despite knowing it was a joke. She asked about her cat and handed over some packages, and Constance confirmed she'd brought the eggs that had been forgotten. As a child, Mary Catherine had thought Constance was a fairy princess, drawing her with golden hair and blue eyes and pink cheeks, and she really did look like that, always pink and white and golden, her brightness undimmed. She was the most precious person in Mary Catherine's world. She followed Constance across the grass past her flowers into the house, and her cat Jonas emerged from the flowers to follow her. Inside, Mary Catherine locked the front door behind them. They lived their lives toward the back of the house, the kitchen, the back bedrooms, Uncle Julian's warm room off the kitchen, leaving the front turned toward the highway. From the back lawn, no one could see them. She remembered to be kinder to Uncle Julian when she saw him at his desk in the kitchen corner, playing with his papers. She asked Constance about giving him the peanut brittle, and Constance said after lunch, handling the groceries with quiet reverence. Mary Catherine was not allowed to help prepare food or gather mushrooms, though she sometimes carried vegetables or apples. Constance planned the meal: happily muffins, a soft buttery egg and pudding for Uncle Julian, something lean and rich for Mary Catherine. Jonas would catch a mouse. Constance expressed her happiness at Mary Catherine's return, both for the food and because she missed her. Mary Catherine admitted she was always happy to be home. Constance touched her cheek gently, asking if it had been very bad, but Mary Catherine said she didn't want to hear about it. Constance mentioned that someday she might go out, and Mary Catherine felt another chill. Then Uncle Julian spoke, asking about a detail for his papers, whether their father had taken his cigar in the garden that morning. Constance confirmed that their father certainly had taken his cigar in the garden that morning. She noticed the cat had been fishing in the creek and came back muddy. She folded the grocery bag away with the others and placed the library books on the shelf where they would remain forever, untouched. Mary Catherine and Jonas were expected to stay in their corner while Constance worked, and Mary Catherine found it a joy to watch her sister move beautifully in the sunlight, handling food with such softness. She asked if Constance was frightened about Helen Clark's visit, and Constance smiled, insisting she wasn't. She was getting better, she said, and planned to make little rum cakes. Mary Catherine teased that Helen Clark would gobble them up dramatically. They still saw occasional visitors who drove up the driveway Helen Clark for tea on Fridays, and others who stopped by on Sundays after church to report on the sermon. These women came dutifully, never receiving return calls, staying the proper few minutes, sometimes bringing flowers or books or sheet music for Constance's harp. They spoke politely, invited the sisters to their homes even knowing they'd never come, were civil to Uncle Julian, and called themselves friends. Constance and Mary Catherine always spoke well of them because the women believed their visits brought pleasure. They never used the path they entered by the driveway, accepted garden cuttings if offered, and left the same way. The Carringtons came occasionally, sitting in their car at the front steps, never coming inside or accepting refreshment, asking how the sisters were managing and if they needed anything. Constance always invited them in out of politeness, but they never entered. Mary Catherine wondered if they might bring her a horse for the long meadow, but Constance firmly forbade her to ask for anything from anyone, reminding her they did not ask. Mary Catherine claimed she was teasing, that she only wanted a winged horse to fly them both to the moon. Uncle Julian muttered about a quarrel on that last night, fragments of argument overheard through a door, guessing it was about money. Constance observed that his parents didn't often quarrel, but Uncle Julian noted they were only civil unsatisfactory compared to his own marriage, where shouting was preferred. Constance remarked how it hardly seemed like 6 years, and Mary Catherine, taking the yellow tablecloth, heard her sister behind her say she would give anything to have them all back. As a child, Mary Catherine had believed she would one day grow tall enough to touch the tops of the drawing-room windows, summer windows, in what was meant to be a summer house, heated only because they had no other winter home. Their mother's windows were 14 feet high, with light blue silk drapes that gave the house a gaunt, narrow look from outside. But inside, the drawing room was lovely, filled with golden-legged chairs from the Rochester house, mirrors, sparkling glass, and a mother's harp. Constance and Mary Catherine kept it perfectly, though they only used it for Helen Clark's teas. Constance would stand on a step-ladder to wash the high windows. Mary Catherine would dust the Dresden figurines and use a cloth on a broom to clean the wedding cake trim along the ceiling, walking backward and growing dizzy, laughing when Constance caught her. They polished floors, mended tiers in the rose brocade, and kept everything shining, even though their mother had never allowed them in this room when she was alive. Their mother had served tea from a low table by the fireplace, so Constance did the same. She sat on the rose sofa under their mother's portrait, and Mary Catherine watched from her small corner chair, allowed only to carry and pass items, not to pour. She disliked eating while watched, so she took her tea afterward in the kitchen. On the last day Helen Clark ever came, Constance set out the rose-colored cups, silver dishes of sandwiches, and special rum cakes, with 2 rum cakes waiting in the kitchen for Mary Catherine. Constance sat quietly, hands in her lap, not fidgeting. Mary Catherine waited at the window, seeing Helen Clark's car turn into the driveway, and then saw there were 2 people in it. She warned Constance, who insisted it would be all right, that she had to take a first step eventually. Mary Catherine wanted to send them away, but Constance refused. When she opened the front door, Mary Catherine saw it was little Mrs. Wright, who had come once before and been terrified. Helen Clark greeted her breezily, pretending it was normal to bring almost strangers, while Mrs. Wright murmured she had wanted to come again. Mary Catherine slipped ahead to tell Constance it was the frightened one, and Constance smiled, calling it a weak first step, but insisting it would be fine. Helen Clark in the hall was showing off the staircase to Mrs. Wright, a familiar story about carving in wood from Italy. When they entered the drawing room, Constance was perfectly composed, rising to greet them. Helen Clark's ungraceful movement sent Mrs. Wright careening into the far corner onto an uncomfortable chair, and Helen Clark herself settled too close to Constance on the sofa, nearly upsetting the tea table. Constance handled the introductions and small talk gracefully, asking about gardening, laughing easily, though Mary Catherine could tell she was talking a little too much and too fast. Mary Catherine could see that Constance was talking too much too quickly, but no one else seemed to notice. Mrs. Wright burst out with her love of gardens, and Helen Clark immediately asked about Uncle Julian before the other woman had quite finished. Constance reported he was well, and expected to join them for tea. When Helen Clark mentioned Uncle Julian to Mrs. Wright, describing him as eccentric, Mary Catherine silently objected if eccentric meant deviating from regularity. Helen Clark was far more eccentric with her awkward movements and unexpected questions, and her habit of bringing strangers to tea. Uncle Julian lived smoothly, in a perfectly planned pattern. She remembered she was supposed to be kinder to him. Helen Clark then claimed Constance was one of her closest friends, and Mary Catherine wondered at her blindness to how Constance withdrew from such declarations. Helen Clark delivered her advice. Spring had come. Constance was young and lovely. She had a right to happiness. She should come back into the world. Words that would have made Constance retreat a month ago now made her listen and smile, even as she shook her head. Helen Clark pressed on, saying she'd done penance long enough. Mrs. Wright tried to add something about a luncheon. Mary Catherine announced she'd get the milk, rising abruptly. She saw the kitchen now as dreary, where it had been bright that morning. Constance had seemed on the verge of agreeing, of stepping outside at last. This was the 3rd time that day the subject had come up, and 3 times made it real. Mary Catherine couldn't breathe, felt tied with wire, her head huge and about to explode. She opened the back door to gasp for air, wanting to run to the end of the land and back, but Constance was alone with them, and she had to hurry. She smashed her mother's milk pitcher on the floor, leaving the pieces where Constance would see them, then took the second best pitcher which didn't match the cups, filled it, and returned. Constance was saying something about Mary Catherine as she entered, then smiled and thanked her, glancing at the replacement pitcher. Mary Catherine set it down. Helen Clark advised taking things slowly, just a few calls on old friends, perhaps a shopping trip to the city where no one would recognize her. Mrs. Wright chimed in hopefully about a luncheon. Constance made a laughing, bewildered gesture, saying she'd have to think. Helen Clark mentioned she'd need clothes. Mary Catherine brought tea to Mrs. Wright, whose hand trembled as she took the cup. Mary Catherine offered sugar, and Mrs. Wright declined, flustered. Mary Catherine noted she'd dressed in black again, as she had on her first visit, always in good taste, she thought, except in their mother's drawing room. She brought the plate of rum cakes, offering them to Mrs. Wright even though sandwiches should have come first. She wanted the woman in black to be uncomfortable. Mrs. Wright hesitated, took one, set it carefully on her saucer. Mary Catherine urged her to take 2, saying everything her sister cooked was delicious, but Mrs. Wright refused, almost hysterically polite. Helen Clark ate sandwiches rapidly, reaching past Constance. She wouldn't behave like this anywhere else. Mary Catherine thought she supposes were so glad to see her. Mary Catherine silently willed her to go away, imagining Helen Clark in absurd costumes, a bathing suit on a snowbank, tangled in a tree in pink ruffles, screaming. She almost laughed. Helen Clark suggested Constance, Invite people over, perhaps for dinner, though perhaps not at first. Mary Catherine had to say something. When Constance wasn't looking at her, she loudly asked, why not invite some good people from the village? Helen Clark laughed, surprised, noting that the Blackwoods had never mingled socially with villagers. Mary Catherine said they hated them, and Helen Clark dismissed it as imagination, exaggerated out of proportion, insisting she'd always been a close friend, and not ashamed. Mary Catherine announced Uncle Julian was coming, hearing his wheelchair in the hall. He appeared in the doorway, wearing a dandyish tie and freshly washed face, bowing gallantly to the ladies. Helen Clark remarked, he looked well. Uncle Julian expressed astonishment that anyone would be afraid to visit, reminding them his niece had been acquitted of murder. There could be no danger now. Mrs. Wright flinched. Uncle Julian went on about dangers everywhere. Garden plants more deadly than snakes, herbs that slash like knives. Mrs. Wright hastily complimented the garden. Helen Clark tried to shut it down, saying it was all forgotten, but Uncle Julian insisted it was a fascinating case, his life's work. Helen Clark appealed to good taste. Uncle Julian asked if she'd ever tasted arsenic, describing the moment of utter incredulity. Mrs. Wright, who had seemed too proper to mention it, breathlessly asked if he remembered. Uncle Julian happily confirmed, eager to share the story. Helen Clark cut him off, saying Mrs. Wright didn't want to hear it. But Mary Catherine and Constance exchanged a glance. Both sober-faced on the surface but sharing merriment underneath it. Was good to hear Uncle Julian, who was so lonely most of the time. Mrs. Wright's discipline finally crumbled under Uncle Julian's temptation. She blurted out that it had happened in this very house, then immediately apologized, blushing deeply. Constance confirmed it was in the dining room during dinner. Uncle Julian elaborated a family gathering for the evening meal, never suspecting it would be their last. Mrs. Wright, hopelessly lost to decorum, seized on the arsenic in the sugar. Uncle Julian acknowledged he'd used that sugar on his blackberries, but fate had intervened. Some of them took the fatal step. Some took very little sugar, Constance stated. She never touched berries and rarely used sugar, then or now. Uncle Julian noted that this had counted against her at trial, though she'd always refused berries since childhood. Helen Clark tried to stop the discussion, calling it outrageous, but Mrs. Wright was captivated. Uncle Julian continued, explaining his good fortune in surviving the most sensational poisoning case of the century. He had all the newspaper clippings, exhaustive notes, and had never been well since. Helen Clark insisted she didn't want to talk about it, and Uncle Julian faltered, asking if it hadn't really happened. Constance reassured him it had, and he touched his papers uncertainly. Mrs. Wright leaned forward earnestly, and Uncle Julian, maneuvering his wheelchair to turn his back on Helen Clark, offered to show her the dining room, the fatal board. He hadn't testified at trial due to his health, though he'd wanted to, but his niece had been acquitted anyway. Helen Clark reached for her purse and gloves, insisting no one thought about it anymore, but Mrs. Wright timidly asked for just a glance. Uncle Julian led her across the hall, describing the round table, overlarge now for the pitiful remnant of the family but left as a monument. He recounted the seating arrangement, his brother John at the head, proud of his table and family. Helen Clark, still in the drawing room, remarked angrily that she remembered Constance's father well, and that the accused woman had never even met him. Mary Catherine mused that faces fade from memory, wondering if she'd recognize Mrs. Wright in the village, or if the timid woman would walk past without seeing her. Mrs. Wright's tea and rum cake sat untouched. In the dining room, Uncle Julian continued his narrative. His sister-in-law, a delicate woman born for tragedy, slightly silly himself, younger then, and not an invalid. The boy Thomas, who had used the most sugar. Constance and Uncle Julian's wife Dorothy on either side of his brother, and Mary Catherine, a child of 12 sent to bed without supper, not at table. Mary Catherine laughed, and Constance explained to Helen Clark that Maricat was always in disgrace, a wicked, disobedient child, and she used to bring dinner up the back stairs. Helen Clark criticized the unhealthy environment, saying a child should be punished but still feel loved. Uncle Julian described the meal in detail: spring lamb with mint jelly, spring potatoes, new peas, salad, all from Constance's garden. He noted how the dinner revolved around Constance, and Mrs. Wright seized on the blackberries as the important part. Uncle Julian praised her precise mind and explained that Constance could access many deadly substances without leaving home: poison hemlock, thornapple, baneberry, velvet grass with hydrocyanic acid, deadly nightshade related to the tomato, and the mushroom family, including the death cup. Mrs. Wright declared she shouldn't have been doing the cooking, and Uncle Julian agreed that if her intention was poison, they'd have been foolish to encourage her. But she'd been acquitted of both deed and intention. Mrs. Wright asked what was wrong with Mrs. Blackwood doing her own cooking, and Uncle Julian shuddered, saying he personally preferred to chance the arsenic. Helen Clark announced they must leave, blaming Mrs. Wright for raising the subject. Constance mentioned putting up wild strawberries, and Helen Clark grew impatient. Uncle Julian returned to the sugar bowl, a heavy silver heirloom that Constance had washed before the doctor or police came, emptying and scrubbing it with boiling water. Constance claimed there was a spider in it. Mrs. Wright thought she could have found a better excuse. Why not just take the spider out? Uncle Julian asked what reason she would have given, and Mrs. Wright admitted she'd never killed anyone, so she didn't know. She'd probably say the first thing that came to mind, since she must have been upset. Uncle Julian described the fearful pangs of arsenic and expressed sympathy for the victims, noting he'd lingered in great pain for days. But by then Constance had been arrested. Mrs. Wright, now more forceful, admitted she'd always wanted to meet the family and find out what happened there. Was that one question no one could answer? She listed the evidence. Constance bought arsenic to kill rats, cooked dinner, set the table, watched them die without calling a doctor, washed the sugar bowl, told police they deserved to die, and said it was all her fault. Uncle Julian defended her. She was excited, her remark misconstrued. She wasn't hard-hearted, and thought he was among them, though they all deserved to die. She wasn't the one to point it out. He advised against her taking full blame, which smacked of self-pity. Mrs. Wright pressed the great unanswered question: why did she do it? Unless they agreed Constance was a homicidal maniac. But then Uncle Julian reminded her she'd met Constance. Mrs. Wright, flustered, realized she'd forgotten that the pretty young girl she'd taken to was actually the accused. Helen Clark abruptly announced she was leaving, slamming her pocketbook under her arm, and declaring they'd overstayed all decency. It was after 5. Mrs. Wright scurried out apologizing, and Mary Catherine pointed out she hadn't touched her tea, making the woman blush and claim it was delicious. Uncle Julian folded his hands contentedly in the center of the room, gazing soberly at the ceiling. Helen Clark said curt goodbyes, and Mrs. Wright, looking like a child about to be punished, thanked Constance and said goodbye to Uncle Julian. Helen Clark started the car before Mrs. Wright was fully inside, and her little shriek echoed as they drove away. Mary Catherine came back laughing and kissed Constance, calling it a very nice tea party. Constance laughed too, dismissing Helen Clark as ill-bred, pretentious, and stupid. Mary Catherine suggested she wanted to reform Constance. She collected Mrs. Wright's untouched tea and cake, calling her poor little Mrs. Wright. Constance noted she'd been teasing her, and Mary Catherine admitted she couldn't help it. When people were frightened, she wanted to frighten them more. Uncle Julian asked how he'd been, and Constance pronounced him superb, touching his head lightly. He'd needed no notes. He asked if it had really happened, and Constance confirmed it had. She offered to take him to his room to look at his clippings, but he declined, tired from the superlative afternoon, saying he'd rest until dinner. Later, as Constance worked in the kitchen, Mary Catherine finally asked the question that had chilled her all afternoon. Was she going to do what Helen Clark had said? Constance didn't pretend not to understand, just smiled a little, and said she didn't know. A change was coming, and only Mary Catherine sensed it, though Constance suspected, standing in her garden and looking outward toward the trees in the driveway, wondering how it would feel to walk to the gates. On Saturday morning, after Helen Clark's visit, Constance looked at the driveway 3 times. Uncle Julian was unwell after tiring himself at tea, staying in bed and calling to Constance. Even Jonas was restless, running up a storm, starting from sleep, racing through the house, unable to settle. At night, they could hear him running, feel him cross their feet in bed. All the omens spoke of change. Mary Catherine woke on Saturday morning thinking she heard them calling her, then remembered they were dead. Constance never called her. She told Constance about it over breakfast, and Constance just urged her to hurry, saying it was another lovely day. On mornings when she didn't go to the village, Mary Catherine had her work. Wednesdays she checked the fence, repairing wires and tightening strands, making sure they were safe for another week. Sundays, she examined her safeguards, the silver dollars buried by the creek, the doll in the long field, the book nailed to the tree in the pine woods. As long as they remained, nothing could get in. She'd always buried things. Treasures Constance gave her, her baby teeth, blue marbles to make the river run dry. All their land was enriched with her buried treasures, a powerful web guarding them beneath the surface. Tuesdays and Fridays she went to the village. Thursdays, her most powerful day, she went into the attic and dressed in their clothes. Mondays she and Constance neatened the house, dusting every room, never altering the perfect line of their mother's tortoiseshell comb. Constance sometimes tried to neaten Uncle Julian's room, but he disliked being disturbed, so she only washed his medicine glasses and changed his bed. Mary Catherine was not allowed in Uncle Julian's room. Saturday mornings she helped Constance in the garden, caring for her tools and carrying baskets of flowers or vegetables. The cellar was filled with food preserved by generations of Blackwood women, jam from great-grandmothers, pickles from great-aunts, vegetables from their grandmother, 6 jars of apple jelly from their mother. Constance had added her own rose, the handsomest of all. Mary Catherine told her she buried food the way she buried treasure, and Constance explained that food from the ground couldn't be allowed to rot. The colorful rows of preserves stood forever in the cellar, a poem by the Blackwood women. They ate Constance's preserves each year, but never touched what belonged to the others. Constance said it would kill them. This Saturday morning Mary Catherine had apricot jam on her toast, thinking of Constance making it and never dreaming a change would come before the jar was finished. Constance called her lazy and sent her to the garden. She arranged Uncle Julian's tray with his hot milk in a daisy-painted jug and tiny square toast. He slept painfully, sometimes taking an extra pill and lying drowsy, wanting to know Constance was nearby. On good mornings she brought him to the kitchen to work at his desk. He always said if he was spared he'd write the book himself. If not, his notes should go to a worthy cynic. Mary Catherine hoped he'd enjoy his breakfast and come out to the garden in his wheelchair. She asked if a tulip might open today, and Constance said not until tomorrow. She warned her to wear boots if she wandered. Mary Catherine said a change was coming, and Constance dismissed it as spring. She took in Uncle Julian's tray, and Mary Catherine heard her greet him. His voice was old, he wasn't well. Constance would need to stay near him all day. Uncle Julian asked if his father was home yet, and Constance said not today. He asked for a pencil to make a note, then confused her with Dorothy. Constance corrected him gently. Mary Catherine decided she would choose 3 powerful protection words. As long as they were never spoken aloud, no change would come. She wrote the first word melody in the apricot jam on her toast and ate it quickly. 1/3, safe. Constance came out of Uncle Julian's room, reporting he'd left most of his breakfast and was very tired. Mary Catherine wished she had a winged horse to fly him to the moon, where everything was safe. Constance thought about working in the vegetable garden but didn't want to leave Uncle Julian. She was deciding on her second magic word, maybe Gloucester, when she suggested making a pie for Uncle Julian. Constance smiled, knowing she really meant for Maricat, and offered rhubarb. Mary Catherine and Jonas disliked rhubarb, but Constance said it had the prettiest colors for jam. Mary Catherine told her to make it for the shells instead, and asked for a dandelion pie. Constance called her silly, standing in her blue dress with sunlight patterning the kitchen floor, and color beginning to show in the garden. Jonas sat on the step washing himself, and Constance sang as she washed the dishes. Mary Catherine was now 2/3 safe, with only one magic word left to find. Later, while Uncle Julian still slept, Constance slipped down to the vegetable garden for a few minutes. Mary Catherine sat at the kitchen table, listening for Uncle Julian so she could call her sister if he woke, but he remained quiet. When Constance returned, Mary Catherine ate tiny sweet raw carrots while Constance washed vegetables and put them away, announcing they'd have a spring salad. Mary Catherine mused that they ate the year away, spring, summer, fall, waiting for things to grow and then consuming them. At 20 minutes past 11, Constance took off her apron, glanced in at Uncle Julian, and went upstairs to her room as she always did, waiting until Mary Catherine called her. Mary Catherine went to the front door, unlocked it, and opened it just as the doctor's car turned into the drive. He hurried in as always, greeting her briefly and heading straight to the kitchen, removing his coat and going directly to Uncle Julian's room. At the door, his manner softened. He greeted Uncle Julian gently, asking how things were. Uncle Julian, as always, asked where the old fool was. Why hadn't Jack Mason come? The doctor explained that Dr. Mason couldn't make it, introducing himself as Dr. Levy. Uncle Julian said he'd rather have Mason, but the doctor promised to do his best. Uncle Julian laughed thinly, saying he'd always known he'd outlive the old fool. Mason had died 3 years ago. The doctor told him it was a pleasure to have him as a patient and closed the door quietly. Mary Catherine considered digitalis for her third magic word, but decided it was too easily spoken. She settled on Pegasus, took a glass from the cabinet, spoke the word distinctly into it, filled it with water, and drank. When Uncle Julian's door opened, and the doctor stood in the doorway, he reminded him to remember, saying he'd see him next Saturday. Uncle Julian called him a quack. The doctor smiled. Then the smile faded as he hurried off, grabbing his coat and heading down the hall. Mary Catherine followed, but by the time she reached the front door he was already going down the steps, bidding her a distracted goodbye, and driving off quickly. She locked the door and called Constance, who answered from upstairs. Later, Uncle Julian was better and sat in the warm afternoon sun, hands folded, half dreaming. Mary Catherine lay on the marble bench their mother had favored, while Constance knelt in the dirt, her hands buried in the soil, kneading and turning it, touching the plants at their roots. Uncle Julian's voice drifted on, recalling that fine morning when none of them knew it was their last. He remembered hearing Constance moving in the kitchen first, then his brother coming down whistling. Constance hummed the tune softly, and Mary Catherine shivered. Uncle Julian mused that if his brother had known it was his last morning, he might have been quieter. He remembered telling his wife to dress and help Constance in the kitchen, as was proper. The wives always did as they were told, though his sister-in-law had lain late that morning, perhaps sensing something. He heard them all, the boy going downstairs, and thought of dressing himself. He could still dress himself then, he noted, though that was the last day he could still walk, dress, feed himself, sleep well as a strong man should. Constance offered a rug for his knees, but he thanked her and continued. He remembered the breakfast, tiny thin pancakes, his brother's fried eggs, his wife taking sausage too much perhaps, though he hadn't encouraged her to eat heavily since they were living in his brother's house. If he'd known it was her last breakfast, he would have permitted her more. His brother was a just man who never stinted his food as long as others didn't take too much. He'd watched his wife take that sausage. The boy ate hugely. Constance offered to make sausage for him next week, and he continued, recalling that his wife helped with the dishes, though she might have done more. His brother went off after breakfast to see a man about an arbor for grapevines, and Uncle Julian had entertained the ladies in the garden, talking about music. His wife was musical, though she couldn't play. His sister-in-law had a delicate touch, and usually played in the evenings, but not that evening. He was happy to have been entertaining that morning. He fell silent, folding and refolding his hands, and Mary Catherine wished she could be kinder to him, but there was nothing she could bring, so she lay still and listened. Constance frowned at a leaf, shadows moving across the lawn. Uncle Julian remembered the boy climbing the chestnut tree, shouting, dropping twigs until his sister-in-law spoke sharply. He thought his wife had been civil to Constance's mother, hoping so since they lived in his brother's house and ate his food. He knew his brother was home for lunch. Constance remembered they'd had a rarebit, made quickly after a morning of working with vegetables. Uncle Julian observed that he'd often wondered why the arsenic wasn't put into the rarebit. It would have hastened things. He disliked rarebit and never ate it, so he'd had a salad instead, with apple pudding for dessert left over from the night before. The warm light was fading from the garden as Constance stood, brushing the last of the soil from her palms. She warned him that the cooling air would soon seep into his bones if she didn't get him inside. Uncle Julian, however, was still lost in his own tangents, remarking that the arsenic would have been better placed in the rarebit than in the sugar, and that it was strange no one had ever thought to point that out. He noted, with a touch of pedantic certainty, that arsenic had no taste, though he insisted a rarebit certainly did. Then, as if surfacing from a dream, he asked where he was being taken. Constance told him indoors, to rest until dinner, and promised to play for him afterward if he wished. He declined the offer, claiming he had no time to spare. There were too many details to preserve, too many fragments of that last day to record before they slipped away. He mused that, all things considered, it had been a pleasant final day for the others, and that it was probably for the best that none of them had known it would be their last. Then, as an afterthought, he admitted he was cold. Constance assured him he would be settled in his room within moments. Mary Catherine lingered behind, reluctant to leave the darkening garden. Jonas followed her, drawn toward the warm light spilling from the house. By the time they stepped inside, Constance was just easing Uncle Julian's door shut. She gave Mary Catherine a soft smile, and murmured that he was already nearly asleep. Mary Catherine asked, with a sudden quiet dread, whether Constance would care for her when she was as old as Uncle Julian. Constance answered lightly, with a faint smile, that she would, if she was still there. The answer sent a chill through Mary Catherine. She retreated to a corner, gathering Jonas onto her lap, and watched Constance move through the bright kitchen with her usual swift, silent grace. Soon, she knew, Constance would ask her to set the table in the dining room, and after that, night would fall, and they would sit together in the warm kitchen, safe and hidden, with no one from the outside world able to see even a glimmer of their light. By Sunday morning the sense of change had drawn one day closer. Mary Catherine was determined not to let her three magic words Melody, Gloucester, Pegasus enter her conscious mind, yet the air itself seemed thick with transformation, settling over the stairs, the kitchen, and the garden like a heavy fog. The weather felt restless. She wondered if Jonas might finally succeed in raising a storm. Even as the sun shone and clouds hurried across the sky, with a brisk wind slipping in and out of the kitchen while she ate her breakfast, Constance told her to wear her boots if she wandered, and Mary Catherine replied that Uncle Julian probably wouldn't be sitting outside today, given the coolness. Constance called it pure spring weather and smiled toward her garden. Mary Catherine declared her love, and Constance returned the affection, calling her silly. When Mary Catherine asked if Uncle Julian was feeling any better, Constance admitted she didn't think so. He had taken his tray while Mary Catherine was still asleep and seemed very tired, having taken an extra pill during the night. She feared he was growing worse. Mary Catherine asked if she was worried, and Constance said yes, very. When pressed on whether he would die, Constance recounted what he had said that morning. He had mistaken her for Aunt Dorothy, held her hand, and confessed how terrible it was to be old and lie there waiting. The confession had frightened her. Mary Catherine suggested she should have let him go to the moon instead. Constance mentioned that after giving him his hot milk, he had remembered who she was. Mary Catherine reflected that Uncle Julian was probably quite happy, with both her and Aunt Dorothy to care for him, and she reminded herself that long, thin things would serve as cues to be kinder to him. There had already been a hair in her toothbrush, a fragment of string on her chair, and a splinter on the back step. She suggested, "Constance, make him a pudding." Constance considered it, pulling out a long, thin slicing knife, and mentioned cocoa and dumplings for his chicken that night. When Mary Catherine asked if she was needed, Constance told her no, to run along and to wear her boots. The world outside was alive with shifting light, and Jonas danced through the shadows beside her as she moved. When she ran, he ran. When she stopped, he paused, glanced at her, and then trotted off in another direction, as if they were strangers, only to sit and wait for her to run again. They headed for the long field, which today looked like an endless ocean, though she had never seen one. The grass swayed under the breeze, cloud shadows raced across its surface, and the distant trees seemed to shift and breathe. Jonas vanished into the tall grass, which brushed against her hands as she walked, and she could track his movement by the crooked patterns he left behind. She started at one corner and walked diagonally across the field, and at the center she came to the rock marking the spot where she had buried her doll. She could always find it, even though much of her buried treasure was lost forever. The rock was undisturbed, so the doll was still safe. She walked, imagining herself treading over buried treasure, the grass brushing her hands, with nothing around her but the endless field, the blowing grass, and the pine woods at its edge. Behind her stood the house far to her left. Hidden by trees and nearly invisible was the wire fence their father had built to keep others out. Leaving the long field, she passed between the 4 apple trees they called their orchard and followed the path toward the creek. Her box of silver dollars buried there was still safe. Near the creek, well hidden, was one of her secret shelters, carefully made and often used. She had pulled back a few low bushes and smoothed the ground. The entrance was covered by a branch that almost touched the earth. It wasn't really necessary to be so secret, since no one ever came looking for her here, but she loved the feeling of lying inside with Jonas, knowing she could never be found. Leaves and branches made her bed, and Constance had given her a blanket. The trees above were so thick that it was always dry inside. That Sunday morning she lay there with Jonas, listening to his stories. All cat stories began with the claim that his mother, the first cat, had told him this. She pressed her head close to him and listened. "There is no change coming," she told herself. "It's only spring." She had been wrong to be so frightened. The days would grow warmer, Uncle Julian would sit in the sun, Constance would laugh in her garden, and everything would stay the same. Jonas went on and on about singing, perhaps, and the leaves shifted overhead, and it would always be the same. Near the creek, she found a nest of baby snakes and killed them all. She hated snakes, and Constance had never forbidden it. On her way back to the house, however, she discovered a very bad omen. Her book, nailed to a tree in the pine woods, had fallen down. She decided the nail must have rusted through. The book had been their father's notebook, where he recorded the names of people who owed him money and those he thought should do him favors. It had been useless as protection now. She had wrapped it carefully before nailing it to the tree, but the nail had rusted, and it had fallen. She thought she should destroy it, in case it had turned actively bad, and bring something else out to the tree, perhaps one of their mother's scarves, or a glove. It was already too late, though she didn't know it yet. By the time she found the book, he was probably already on his way. All she and Jonas knew was that they were hungry, and they ran back to the house together, arriving with the breeze through the kitchen door. Constance noticed she had forgotten her boots and tried to scold, but ended up laughing and calling her silly. Mary Catherine pointed out that Jonas had no boots and declared it a wonderful day. Constance mentioned they might gather mushrooms tomorrow. Mary Catherine said they were hungry today. By then, he was already walking through the village toward the Black Rock, with the villagers watching, wondering, and whispering as he passed. It was the last of their slow, lovely days, though, as Uncle Julian would have noted. They never suspected it at the time. Constance and Mary Catherine had lunch, giggling together, unaware that while they were happy, he was testing the locked gate, peering down the path, and wandering the woods, shut out for a time by their father's fence. Rain began to fall as they sat in the kitchen, and they left the door open to watch it slant past the doorway and wash the garden. Constance was pleased, as any good gardener would be. Mary Catherine asked if they would always be together, and Constance wondered if she ever wanted to leave. Mary Catherine asked where they could possibly go. What place could be better? Who outside would want them? The world was full of terrible people. Constance, serious for a moment, then turned and smiled, telling her not to worry, that nothing bad would happen. That must have been exactly the moment he found the entrance and started up the driveway, hurrying through the rain, because she had only a minute or two left before she saw him. She might have used that time to warn Constance, think of a safer magic word, or push the table across the kitchen doorway. But instead, she played with her spoon, looked at Jonas, and when Constance shivered, she offered to get her sweater. That was what brought her into the hall just as he was coming up the steps. She saw him through the dining room window and for a moment went cold and could not breathe. She knew the front door was locked. That was her first thought. She whispered to Constance that someone was outside, telling her to close the kitchen door quickly. She heard Constance move in the kitchen, but Uncle Julian called out at that instant, and Constance went to him, leaving the heart of their house unguarded. Mary Catherine ran to the front door and leaned against it, hearing his steps on the other side. He knocked quietly at first, then more firmly, and she felt each knock through the wood, knowing how close he was. She already knew he was one of the bad ones. She had glimpsed his face briefly. He was the kind who circled the house, trying every entrance, peering through windows, pulling and poking and stealing souvenirs. He knocked again, and called out for Constance by name. They always knew her name. They knew her name, and Uncle Julian's name, and how she wore her hair, and the color of the 3 dresses she had worn in court, and how old she was, and how she talked and moved, and whenever they could, they pressed close to her face to see if she was crying. He called out that he wanted to speak to Constance, the way they always did. It had been a long time since any of them had come, but she had not forgotten how they made her feel. At first, they were always there, waiting for Constance, just wanting to see her. They nudged each other, pointed, whispered that she was the one who didn't look like a murderess. They tried to get pictures of her whenever she appeared. They helped themselves to flowers, to rocks from the garden, to take home as souvenirs. He called her name again, and knocked again, insisting he had something important to say to her. They always had something important to tell Constance, whether they were pushing at the door, yelling outside, calling on the telephone, or writing the terrible, terrible letters. No one ever asked for Mary Catherine. She had been sent to bed without supper, excluded from the courtroom, and never photographed. While the crowds gawked at Constance during the trial, Mary Catherine had lain on a cot in the orphanage, staring at the ceiling, wishing them all dead, waiting for Constance to come and take her home. The man outside kept calling for Constance, pleading for her to listen. Mary Catherine wondered if he could hear her breathing through the door. She knew exactly what he would do next: back away from the house, shield his eyes against the rain, and scan the upstairs windows for any sign of life. Then he would circle to the side, following the walk meant only for her and Constance, and try the side door they never opened. Some of them gave up when they found both doors locked. The ones who felt vaguely embarrassed for coming, who realized there was nothing to see, and wished they had saved their time. They usually hurried off. But the stubborn ones, the ones she wished would drop dead on the driveway, went around and around, trying every entrance, tapping on windows, shouting that they had a right to see her, that she had killed all those people. Hadn't she? They parked their cars right up to the steps, most of them locking their vehicles carefully before coming to pound on the house. They had picnics on the lawn, took pictures of each other posing in front of the house, let their dogs run through the garden, and scrawled their names on the walls and the front door. He called out again, insisting she had to let him in. She heard him step down from the porch and knew he was looking up. All the windows were locked, the side door was locked. She knew better than to peer through the narrow glass panels beside the door. They always noticed the slightest movement, and if she so much as brushed the dining room drapes, he would come running, shouting that he'd seen her. She leaned against the front door, imagining opening it to find him dead on the driveway. He was looking up at a blank, shuttered house, its upstairs windows always shaded. He would find no answer there. She needed to get Constance's sweater before she shivered any more. It was safe to go upstairs, but she wanted to be back with Constance while he waited outside. So she ran up, snatched the sweater from Constance's room, and hurried back down only to find him sitting at the kitchen table, in her chair. She stood there holding the sweater, and told him she had 3 magic words: Melody, Gloucester, Pegasus, and that they had been safe until those words were spoken aloud. Constance turned and smiled, saying it was their cousin Charles Blackwood, and she had recognized him at once because he looked like their father. He stood up, seeming to grow taller and larger as he came toward her, and asked for a kiss. Behind him, the kitchen door stood wide open. He was the first one who had ever gotten inside, and Constance had let him in. Constance stood, knowing better than to touch her, but called her name gently, and held out her arms. Mary Catherine felt herself bound tight, wound with wire, unable to breathe, and she had to run. She threw the sweater on the floor and fled out the door, down to the creek where she always went. Jonas found her after a while, and they lay together, sheltered from the rain by the crowding trees, which pressed close in a dim, knowing, possessive way. She listened to the soft sound of the water, and convinced herself there was no cousin, no Charles Blackwood, no intruder inside. It was because the book had fallen from the tree she had neglected to replace it, and their wall of safety had cracked. Tomorrow she would find something powerful and nail it to the tree. She fell asleep listening to Jonas as the shadows closed in. During the night, Jonas left to hunt. She woke slightly when he returned, pressing against her for warmth. She murmured his name, and he purred. When she woke, early morning mists were drifting along the creek, curling around her face. She lay there laughing, feeling the mist's almost imaginary touch on her eyes, and looked up into the trees. When she came into the kitchen, still trailing mist from the creek, Constance was arranging Uncle Julian's breakfast tray. Uncle Julian was clearly feeling better. Constance was giving him tea instead of hot milk, so he must have awakened early and asked for it. Mary Catherine went to Constance and put her arms around her. Constance turned and hugged her back, greeting her warmly. Mary Catherine asked if Uncle Julian was better, and Constance said he was much better, and the sun would shine after yesterday's rain. She was going to make a chocolate mousse for dinner. Mary Catherine declared her love, and Constance returned it, then asked what she wanted for breakfast. Mary Catherine requested pancakes, little tiny hot ones, and 2 fried eggs. She announced that her winged horse was coming today to carry them to the moon, where they would eat rose petals. Constance noted that some rose petals were poisonous. Mary Catherine insisted they weren't on the moon, and asked if it was true you could plant a leaf. Constance explained that some leaves, furred ones, could grow roots in water and become new plants, but only the kind they started as. Mary Catherine said she was sorry about that, then greeted Jonas, calling him a furred leaf. Constance laughed and called her silly. Mary Catherine confessed she liked the idea of a leaf growing into a different plant, all furry. Constance, still laughing, said Uncle Julian would never get his breakfast if she kept listening, and took the tray into his room, announcing hot tea was coming. Uncle Julian's voice came from within, remarking on the glorious morning and calling it a splendid day for work. Constance agreed, adding that it was also a good day to sit in the sun. Jonas sat in the sunlit doorway, washing his face. Mary Catherine was hungry. She thought it might be kind to Uncle Julian today if she placed a feather on the lawn where his chair would go, though she wasn't allowed to bury things in the lawn. On the moon, she imagined, they wore feathers in their hair, and rubies on their hands, and ate with gold spoons. From inside the room, Uncle Julian asked if he should begin chapter 44 today. Constance assured him he should. He noted that some early pages needed brushing up. A work like this was never done. Constance offered to brush his hair, but he declined, saying a man's head should be his own responsibility. He mentioned he had no jam. Constance offered to get some, but he realized he had already eaten all his toast. He then expressed a fancy for broiled liver at lunch, and Constance promised he would have it, offering to take his tray. He agreed, and said he would brush his hair. Constance returned to the kitchen and set down the tray, turning her attention to Mary Catherine. Mary Catherine reminded her that Jonas needed breakfast too, but Constance said he had eaten long ago. Mary Catherine asked if Constance would plant a leaf for her some day. Constance said one of these days, then paused, listening, and remarked that he was still asleep. Mary Catherine asked who and whether she would watch it grow, but Constance answered that Cousin Charles was still asleep, and the day collapsed around her. She saw Jonas in the doorway and Constance by the stove, but they had no color. She couldn't breathe. She was bound tight, everything cold. She insisted he was a ghost. Constance laughed, a sound very far away, and said that if that were true, then a ghost was sleeping in her father's bed and had eaten a hearty dinner last night while she was gone. She added, Mary Catherine said she had dreamed he came, but then dreamed him away. She held tight to that belief. If Constance believed her, she could breathe again. But Constance revealed they had talked for a long time last night. Mary Catherine, barely breathing, told her to go and look to see that he wasn't there. Constance just called her silly. She couldn't run. She had to help Constance. She took her glass and smashed it on the floor, declaring that now he would go away. Constance came to the table and sat down across from her, looking very serious. Mary Catherine wanted to go around and hug her, but she still had no color. Constance explained slowly that Cousin Charles was real, and he was their cousin. As long as his father, Arthur Blackwood, their father's brother, had been alive, Charles couldn't come to them or try to help, because his father wouldn't allow it. Their father's brother had thought very badly of them. He had refused to care for Mary Catherine during the trial, and had never allowed their names to be mentioned in his house. Mary Catherine asked why they should mention his name in theirs. Constance said she was trying to explain as soon as his father died. Charles had hurried here to help them. Mary Catherine asked how he could help when they were already happy. Constance agreed. They were happy, but asked her to be pleasant to Cousin Charles. She could breathe a little now. It was going to be all right. Cousin Charles was a ghost, but a ghost that could be driven away. She said he would go away, and Constance agreed that he probably didn't plan to stay forever. He had only come for a visit. Mary Catherine knew she would have to find something, a device, to use against him. She asked if Uncle Julian had seen him, and Constance said he knew Charles was here, but had been too unwell to leave his room, having only a little soup for dinner last night. She was glad he had asked for tea this morning. Mary Catherine declared that today they would neaten the house. Constance agreed, but said they would do it later, after Cousin Charles was awake, and she ought to sweep up the broken glass before he came down. Mary Catherine watched her sweep today. Would be a glittering day full of tiny sparkling things. There was no point in hurrying her breakfast, because she couldn't go out until they had neatened the house, so she lingered, drinking milk slowly and watching Jonas. Before she finished, Uncle Julian called Constance to help him into his chair, and she brought him into the kitchen, setting him by his table and papers. He announced he would commence chapter 44, beginning with a slight exaggeration and proceeding into an outright lie. He told Constance he was going to say his wife was beautiful. The sound of a footstep overhead broke their silence, heavy, even and wrong, tramping where only Constance's light step or none at all had ever been heard. Constance identified it as Cousin Charles. Uncle Julian, arranging his papers with deliberate care, remarked that he anticipated considerable pleasure from his brother's son, hoping Charles might fill in details about his family's behavior during the trial, though he admitted he already had notes on a possible conversation they might have had. He suspected this would delay chapter 44. Mary Catherine retreated to her corner with Jonas, while Constance went into the hall to greet Charles as he came down the stairs. The voice was the same as the night before. She drew further into her corner as Constance brought him into the kitchen, and Uncle Julian turned his chair to face the doorway. Charles expressed his pleasure at finally meeting his uncle. Uncle Julian noted that Charles was Arthur's son but resembled their dead brother John. Charles mentioned that Arthur was dead too, which was why he had come. Uncle Julian inquired, with a hint of irony, whether Arthur had died wealthy. He himself had always been the only brother with no knack for money. Charles admitted his father had left nothing. Uncle Julian called it a pity, recalling that their own father had left a considerable sum, even divided among the three brothers, and expressed surprise that Arthur's share had vanished, wondering if Charles's mother had been extravagant. He didn't remember her clearly, though he did recall that when Constance wrote to her uncle during the trial, it was his wife who answered, requesting that the family connection be severed. Charles said he had wanted to come earlier. Uncle Julian dismissed this as youthful curiosity, suggesting that a notorious woman like Constance would naturally appeal to a young man's romantic imagination. Then he called to Constance, asking if he had had his breakfast, and when she confirmed it, he requested another cup of tea, declaring that he and Charles had much to discuss. Mary Catherine still couldn't see him clearly, perhaps because he was a ghost, perhaps because he was so large. His round face, so like their father's, turned from Constance to Uncle Julian and back, smiling and talking. She pressed herself as far into her corner as she could, but finally that big face turned toward her. He greeted her by name. She buried her face in Jonas's fur. He asked Constance if she was shy, and reassured himself that kids always took to him. Constance laughed, remarking that they didn't seem any strangers. She seemed neither awkward nor uncomfortable, as though she had been expecting Charles all her life, as though she had always known exactly what to do and say, almost as if there had always been a room kept for him in the house of her life. He came closer, remarking on Jonas and asking his name. Mary Catherine, after a moment's hesitation, offered only the cat's name. He repeated it and asked if Jonas was her special pet. She said yes. They stared at each other, she and Jonas, not daring to blink or look away. His big white face, still resembling their father's, smiled down at them, and he declared they were going to be good friends. Constance asked what he would like for breakfast, smiling at Mary Catherine because she had spoken. Charles said he would take whatever she was serving. Constance mentioned that Mary Catherine had had pancakes. Charles agreed enthusiastically, calling it a perfect start to a beautiful day in charming company. Uncle Julian observed that pancakes were an honored dish in the family, though he rarely ate them due to his delicate health. They had been served on that last morning, but Constance interrupted, noting his papers were spilling. Charles knelt to gather them, and Constance promised he would see her garden after breakfast. Uncle Julian thanked him, calling him chivalrous, and noted that he himself couldn't leap across a room anymore. He guessed Charles was a year or so older than Constance. Charles confirmed he was 32. Uncle Julian placed Constance at about 28, and then, complaining of an empty stomach, asked where his breakfast was. Constance reminded him he had finished an hour ago and said she was making him tea and pancakes for Charles. Uncle Julian called Charles intrepid, noting that although Constance's cooking was of a very high standard, it had certain disadvantages. Charles declared he wasn't afraid to eat anything she cooked. Uncle Julian congratulated him, clarifying that he had meant the effect of heavy food on a delicate stomach, though he acknowledged Charles's reference was likely to arsenic. Constance told them both to come and eat. Mary Catherine laughed into Jonas's fur. Charles took a long moment to pick up his fork, still smiling at Constance. Finally, aware that Constance, Uncle Julian, Jonas, and Mary Catherine were all watching, he cut a small piece of pancake and lifted it to his mouth, but couldn't quite bring himself to eat it. He set the fork down and turned to Uncle Julian, suggesting that while he was there, he could help with digging in the garden or running errands. He was good at hard work. Constance, with an edge of sharpness, pointed out that he had eaten dinner there last night and woken up alive this morning. Charles looked confused for a moment, then seemed to remember, picked up his fork, and quickly ate the piece of pancake, declaring it delicious. Constance smiled. Uncle Julian announced he would postpone Chapter 44 and return to Chapter 17, where he had mentioned Charles's family and their attitude during the trial. He called Charles a clever young man and said he was eager to hear his story. Charles dismissed it as long ago. Uncle Julian said he should have kept notes. Charles argued that it could all be forgotten, that there was no point keeping those memories alive. Uncle Julian repeated the word with disbelief. Charles insisted it had been a sad and horrible time that wouldn't do Constance any good to keep talking about. Uncle Julian accused him of slighting his work, reminding him that a man does his work and doesn't take it lightly. Charles said he simply refused to discuss it further. Uncle Julian turned to Constance, uncertain, and asked if it had really happened if he remembered correctly. Constance hesitated, then confirmed it. Uncle Julian gestured at his papers, his voice trailing. She assured him it was real. Mary Catherine was angry with Charles for being unkind to Uncle Julian. She remembered that today was meant to be a day of sparkles and light, and resolved to find something bright and pretty to put near his chair. Constance asked if Uncle Julian wanted to go outside, and if he was warm enough. She thought so. He shook his head sadly, pencil set aside. Constance fetched his shawl and draped it gently over his shoulders. Charles continued eating his pancakes, not looking up. Mary Catherine wondered if he cared. Constance told Uncle Julian the sun would be warm, the garden bright, and he would have broiled liver for lunch. Uncle Julian reconsidered, saying perhaps just an egg. Constance wheeled him carefully to the door and eased him down the step. Charles started to rise to help, but she shook her head, telling Uncle Julian she would put him in a special corner where she could see him every minute and wave hello 5 times an hour. They could hear her talking as she wheeled him away. Jonas left Mary Catherine to sit in the doorway and watch. Charles spoke to the cat, remarking that Cousin Mary didn't like him and asking Jonas how he could change that. He noted that she wouldn't even be polite, despite his visit to his dear cousins and old uncle. Mary Catherine hated the way he talked to Jonas and the way Jonas seemed to listen. At the sink, a drop of water swelled, ready to fall. She thought about holding her breath until it dropped, hoping Charles would disappear, but knew it was too easy. Charles concluded aloud that Constance liked him, and that was what mattered. Constance returned, stepped over Jonas when he didn't move, and offered Charles more pancakes. He declined, saying he was trying to get acquainted with his little cousin. Constance assured him it wouldn't take long. Mary Catherine finally spoke, announcing that today they would neaten the house. Uncle Julian slept all morning in the garden. Constance often went to the back bedroom windows to look down on him while they worked, sometimes pausing with a dustcloth in hand as if forgetting to return to their mother's jewel box, which held her pearls, sapphire ring, and diamond brooch. Mary Catherine looked out only once, seeing Uncle Julian with his eyes closed and Charles standing nearby. It was ugly to think of Charles walking among the vegetables, under the apple trees, across the lawn where Uncle Julian slept. Constance said they would leave their father's room for the morning since Charles was staying there. Later, she wondered aloud if it would be right to wear their mother's pearls. She had never worn them. Mary Catherine reminded her they had always been in the box, and she would have to take them out. Constance said it wasn't likely anyone would care. Mary Catherine said she would care, if Constance looked more beautiful. Constance laughed, called herself silly, and wondered why she wanted pearls. Mary Catherine insisted they were better off in the box. Charles had closed the door to their father's room, so she couldn't see inside, but she wondered if he had moved things or placed a hat or glove on the dresser. She wondered if he had looked through the closet or drawers. Their father's room faced the front of the house, and she imagined Charles looking down from the windows, out over the lawn and down the long driveway to the road, perhaps wanting to be on that road and home. She asked Constance how long it had taken Charles to get there. Constance guessed 4 or 5 hours by bus, with a walk from the village. Mary Catherine calculated it would take the same to get home when he went. Constance agreed. Mary Catherine noted he would have to walk back to the village. Constance suggested she might take him on her winged horse. Mary Catherine said she didn't have one. Constance insisted Charles was not a bad man. There were sparkles in the mirrors, and inside their mother's jewel box, the diamonds and pearls shone in the darkness. Constance's shadow moved up and down the hall as she went to the window to check on Uncle Julian, while outside, new leaves flickered in the sunlight. Mary Catherine understood that Charles had only gotten in because the magic was broken. If she could reseal the protection around Constance and shut him out, he would have to leave. Every touch he made on the house must be erased. She said aloud that Charles was a ghost, and Constance sighed. She polished the doorknob to their father's room with her dustcloth, and at least one of Charles's touches was gone. When they had finished neatening the upstairs, they came downstairs together, carrying their dustcloths, broom, dustpan, and mop like a pair of witches heading home. In the drawing room, they dusted the golden-legged chairs and the harp, and everything sparkled back at them, even the blue dress in their mother's portrait. Mary Catherine dusted the wedding cake trim with a cloth on the end of a broom, staggering as she looked up, pretending the ceiling was the floor, and she was sweeping, hovering weightless and flying until the room spun, and she was back on the ground looking up. Constance remarked that Charles hadn't yet seen this room, and their mother had been so proud of it. She ought to have shown it to him right away. Mary Catherine asked if she could have sandwiches for lunch, wanting to go down to the creek. Constance warned that sooner or later she would have to sit at the table with him. Mary Catherine promised to do it tonight at dinner. They dusted the dining room, the silver tea service, and the high wooden backs of the chairs. Constance went every few minutes to the kitchen to check on Uncle Julian through the back door, and once she laughed and called out a warning about mud down there, clearly speaking to Charles. Mary Catherine asked where Constance had let him sit at dinner last night. Constance said in their father's chair, adding that he had a perfect right to it as a guest, and he even looked like their father. Mary Catherine asked if he would sit there tonight, and Constance said yes. She dusted their father's chair thoroughly. Though it was little use if he would sit there again, she would have to clean all the silverware. When they finished, they returned to the kitchen. Charles was sitting at the table smoking his pipe, looking at Jonas, who looked back. The smoke was disagreeable, and she hated having Jonas look at him. Constance went out to get Uncle Julian, and they heard him call out for Dorothy, insisting he hadn't been asleep. Charles repeated to Jonas that Cousin Mary didn't like him, and wondered aloud if she knew how he got even with people who didn't like him. He offered to help Constance with the chair and asked Uncle Julian if he'd had a nice nap. Constance made sandwiches for Jonas and Mary Catherine, and they ate them in a tree. She sat in a low fork, Jonas on a nearby branch watching for birds. She told Jonas not to listen to Charles anymore, and he stared at her in wide-eyed astonishment at her audacity. She insisted Charles was a ghost, and Jonas closed his eyes and turned away. She knew it was important to choose the exact device to drive Charles away, and imperfect magic might only bring more disaster. She thought of her mother's jewels, since this was a day of sparkling things, but they might not be strong on a dull day, and Constance would be angry if she took them from the box. She thought of books, always strongly protective, but their father's book had fallen from the tree and let Charles in, so books were perhaps powerless against him. She lay back against the tree trunk, thinking of magic. If Charles hadn't gone away before 3 days, she would smash the mirror in the hall. He sat across from her at dinner in their father's chair, his big white face blotting out the silver on the sideboard behind him. He watched Constance cut up Uncle Julian's chicken and put it correctly on his plate, and watched when Uncle Julian took his first bite and turned it over in his mouth. Constance offered him a biscuit, telling him to eat the soft inside. She had forgotten and put dressing on Mary Catherine's salad, but she wouldn't have eaten anyway with that white face watching. Jonas, not allowed chicken, sat on the floor beside her chair. Charles asked if Uncle Julian always ate with them, and Constance said when he was well enough. Charles wondered how she could stand it. Uncle Julian, addressing Charles as John, remarked that investments weren't what they used to be. Their father had been shrewd, but never understood that times change. Charles asked who he was talking to, and Constance explained he thought he was his brother John. Charles looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head and returned to his chicken. Uncle Julian noted that the chair on Charles's left had been his dead wife's, and he remembered the last time she sat there, but Charles cut him off, shaking a greasy finger and declaring they weren't going to talk about it anymore. Constance was pleased that Mary Catherine had come to the table and smiled at her. She knew Mary Catherine disliked eating while being watched, and would save her plate to bring later. She had forgotten, Mary Catherine noticed, that she'd put dressing on the salad. Charles mentioned he'd noticed a broken back step that morning and offered to fix it, saying he might as well earn his keep. Constance said it would be very kind, as the step had been a nuisance for a long time. He also wanted to go to the village for pipe tobacco, and offered to pick up anything they needed. Mary Catherine, startled, reminded them that she went to the village on Tuesdays. Charles looked at her across the table, his big white face directly on her, and she fell silent, remembering that walking to the village was the first step on his way home. Constance suggested that if Charles didn't mind, it might be a good idea. She never felt quite comfortable when Mary Catherine was away in the village. She would give him a list and money, and he could be their grocery boy. Charles asked if they kept money in the house, and when Constance confirmed it, he said it didn't sound wise. Constance said it was in their father's safe. Uncle Julian, interjecting, assured them he had examined the books thoroughly before committing himself, and could not have been deceived. Charles remarked that he was taking little cousin Mary's job away from her, and she would have to find something else to do. Mary Catherine had prepared her response. She recited the properties of the death cup mushroom, its 3 poisons, Their effects: the delayed onset of symptoms, the violent pains and vomiting. Charles put down his chicken and told her to stop. Constance laughed, calling her silly, and explaining that she had taught her about mushrooms, making her learn the deadly ones. Mary Catherine added that death occurred between 5 and 10 days after eating. Charles said he didn't think it was very funny. Constance just called her silly. The house wasn't secure just because Charles had gone out to the village. Constance had given him a key to the gates. The keys had always hung on a rack by the kitchen door, one for each of them. When Charles left, Constance gave him a key, probably their father's, along with a shopping list and money. He warned her again about keeping money in the house, holding it tight before tucking it away. Mary Catherine watched from her corner, keeping Jonas away while Charles was there. He made sure everything was on the list, not wanting to make 2 trips. She waited until he was well along, probably almost to the Black Rock, then pointed out that he'd forgotten the library books. Constance looked at her and called her wicked, knowing she had wanted him to forget. Mary Catherine insisted he couldn't have known about the books. He didn't belong in the house and had nothing to do with them. Constance, looking into a pot on the stove, mentioned they'd soon be picking lettuce. Mary Catherine started to speak of the moon, then stopped. Constance turned and smiled, imagining that on the moon she had lettuce all year round. Mary Catherine elaborated on the moon. They had everything: lettuce, pumpkin pie, death-cup mushrooms, cat-furred plants, dancing winged horses. All the locks were solid and tight, and there were no ghosts. Uncle Julian would be well. The sun would shine every day, and Constance would wear their mother's pearls and sing. Constance wished she could go there, then wondered if she should start the gingerbread now, since it would be cold if Charles was late. Mary Catherine said she would be there to eat it, but Constance reminded her that Charles had said he loved gingerbread. Mary Catherine built a little house from the library books on the table, calling Constance a witch with a gingerbread house. Constance denied it, saying she had a lovely house where she lived with her sister Maricat. Mary Catherine laughed at her, worrying over the pot with flour on her face, and suggested maybe Charles would never come back. Constance said he had to. She was making gingerbread for him. With Charles having taken her Tuesday occupation, Mary Catherine had nothing to do. She thought of going to the creek, but had no reason to suppose it would even be there, since she never visited on Tuesdays. She imagined the villagers waiting for her, glancing from the corners of their eyes, nudging each other, then turning in astonishment when they saw Charles instead. Perhaps the whole village would falter and slow, bewildered at the absence of Miss Mary Catherine Blackwood. She giggled at the thought of Jim Donnell and the Harris boys peering anxiously up the road. Constance, turning, asked what was funny. Mary Catherine admitted she'd been imagining a gingerbread man she could name Charles and eat. Constance pleaded with her not to. Constancing Constance's growing irritation, partly with her, partly with the gingerbread, she decided it was wiser to slip away. With a free morning and an unease about going outdoors, she thought it a good time to search for a device to use against Charles. She started upstairs. The smell of baking gingerbread followed her almost halfway to the top. Charles had left his door slightly ajar, just enough for her to get a hand inside. She pushed it open wider and looked into their father's room, now Charles's. He had made his bed. His mother must have taught him. His suitcase sat closed on a chair, but his things were scattered on the dresser where their father's possessions had always been: his pipe, a handkerchief, things he had touched and used, dirtying the room. One drawer was slightly open, and she thought again of Charles picking through their father's clothes. She crossed the room softly, not wanting Constance to hear, and peered into the drawer. Something from here might be extraordinarily powerful, carrying Charles's guilt. She wasn't surprised to find he had been looking at their father's jewelry, a leather box containing a gold watch and chain, cufflinks, and a signet ring. She wouldn't touch their mother's jewelry, but Constance had said nothing about their father's, and hadn't even come in to neaten the room. She opened the box. The watch lay in its own small case. Resting on satin, not ticking the chain, was curled beside it. She wouldn't touch the ring. The thought of a closed circle around her finger made her feel trapped, but she liked the chain, which twisted and wound around her hand when she picked it up. She put the jewelry box back, closed the drawer, left the room and shut the door behind her. In her own room, the chain curled into a sleeping gold heap on her pillow. She had intended to bury it, but then thought of how long it had lain in the darkness of the box, and decided it had earned a place up high, where it could sparkle in sunlight. She would nail it to the tree where the book had fallen. While Constance made gingerbread, Uncle Julian slept, and Charles walked the village stores. She lay on her bed and played with the golden chain. Later, Uncle Julian leaned forward curiously, recognizing his brother's gold watch chain and remarking that he'd thought it had been buried with him. Charles held it out with a shaking hand, his voice trembling as he described finding it nailed to a tree. Constance dismissed it as unimportant, but Charles insisted it was gold. She said no one wanted it. Charles mourned over a smashed link, lamenting that he could have worn it, and that it was a terrible way to treat something valuable. They could have sold it. Constance asked why. Uncle Julian repeated his surprise, noting his brother had never been one to give things away. He supposed he'd never known they kept it from him. Charles explained to Constance that it was worth money, and sensible people didn't nail valuable things to trees. Constance said lunch would get cold if he kept worrying. Charles said he would put it back where it belonged. No one but Mary Catherine noticed that he knew where that was. He added that later they would find out how it got on the tree. Constance told him Mary Catherine had put it there and urged him to come to lunch. Charles asked how she knew, and she smiled, calling her silly Maricat. Charles repeated the question slowly, looking at her. Uncle Julian observed that his brother had been very fond of his person, given to adorning himself and not overly clean. The kitchen fell quiet. Constance was in Uncle Julian's room, putting him down for his nap. Charles spoke to Jonas, musing where poor cousin Mary would go if her sister turned her out, and what she would do if Constance and Charles didn't love her. Mary Catherine decided she might simply ask Charles to leave. Perhaps he needed to be asked politely just once. Perhaps the idea hadn't occurred to him, and she needed to put it there. It was the next thing to do, before he was everywhere in the house and could never be removed. Already the house smelled of him. His pipe and shaving lotion and his noise echoed all day. His pipe was sometimes on the kitchen table. His gloves, tobacco pouch, and constant matches were scattered through the rooms. He walked to the village each afternoon and brought back newspapers, leaving them anywhere, even where Constance might see them. A spark from his pipe had left a tiny burn on the rose brocade in the drawing room. Constance hadn't noticed, and Mary Catherine hadn't told her, hoping the house, injured, would reject him on its own. She asked Constance. On a bright morning, Charles had been there 3 days now, if he'd said anything about leaving. Constance was increasingly cross about it. She frowned at Mary Catherine, often, as if she looked different somehow. She insisted she wouldn't hear any more silliness about Charles. He was their cousin, invited to visit, and would probably go when he was ready. Mary Catherine said he made Uncle Julian sicker. Constance argued. He was only trying to keep Uncle Julian from thinking sad thoughts all the time, and she agreed Uncle Julian should be cheerful. Mary Catherine asked why he should be cheerful if he was going to die. Constance said she hadn't been doing her duty. Mary Catherine didn't understand. Constance, standing by the stove in sunlight, spoke slowly, as if unsure of the words she had been hiding. Letting Uncle Julian live in the past, living that one dreadful day she had let Mary Catherine run wild. How long since she combed her hair? Mary Catherine couldn't allow herself to be angry, especially not with Constance, but she wished Charles dead. Constance needed guarding more than ever. If she became angry and looked aside, she might be lost. She started cautiously about the moon, but Constance laughed unpleasantly, saying it was all her fault. She hadn't realized how wrong she was, letting things go on because she wanted to hide. It wasn't fair to Mary Catherine or Uncle Julian. Mary Catherine asked if Charles was also mending the broken step. Constance said Uncle Julian should be in a hospital with nurses, and then suddenly, seeing her old Maricat again, she opened her arms and laughed at herself for scolding. Mary Catherine went to her and held her, declaring her love. Constance called her a good child. She left then to talk to Charles. She knew she would dislike it, but it was almost too late to ask politely, and she thought she should ask once. The garden itself had become strange with Charles's figure in it. She saw him under the apple trees, which seemed crooked and shortened beside him. She came out the kitchen door and walked slowly toward him, trying to think charitably, though whenever she imagined his big white face grinning at her across the table, she wanted to beat him until he went away, to stamp on him after he was dead. She made her mind charitable and approached. She called his name, and he turned. She announced she had decided to ask him to go away. He acknowledged he had been asked. She repeated the request. He said no. She couldn't think of anything further to say. She noticed he was wearing their father's gold watch chain, even with the crooked link, and knew without looking that the watch was in his pocket. Tomorrow, he would be wearing the signet ring, she thought, and wondered if he would make Constance put on their mother's pearls. She warned him to stay away from Jonas. He countered that in about a month he wondered who would still be there, her or him. She fled back through the house, her footsteps pounding up the stairs to her father's old room. Once inside, she grabbed a shoe and struck the mirror above the dresser again and again, watching the glass spiderweb and crack across its surface. Only then, spent, did she retreat to her own room and lay her head against the windowsill, letting exhaustion pull her into sleep. Those days were haunted by a growing guilt. She kept reminding herself to show more kindness to Uncle Julian. The old man had become a recluse, taking his meals in his room more and more often, emerging only for dinner, where he endured Charles's contemptuous gaze. She heard Charles snap at Constance about the old man's messiness, suggesting he needed to be fed like an infant uncle. Julian's flustered protests went unheeded as Charles laughed at him. The mornings had taken on a cruel rhythm, Charles gorging himself at the kitchen table, while Uncle Julian drifted in and out of consciousness in his darkened room, his calls for Constance dismissed by Charles as attention-seeking. She took to eating her breakfast early, fleeing outdoors to the chestnut tree if Charles appeared. Once she even plucked a fresh leaf and placed it on Uncle Julian's windowsill, standing in the sunlight to peer into his dim room, searching for some way to ease his decline. When she asked Constance to make him a soft cake, Charles cut her off with a mouthful of food, insisting Constance was too overworked. Her plea that Uncle Julian was dying was brushed aside with a command to go play. She followed Charles one afternoon when he walked to the village, stopping at the Black Rock. It wasn't her day to venture into town. She watched him chat with Stella in the sun, buy a paper, and settle onto the benches with the other men before turning back. The thought of shopping again, of becoming one of the figures he watched from that bench, unsettled her. Returning home, she found Constance working in the garden while Uncle Julian dozed in his chair. When she sat on her bench, Constance asked where she'd been. She answered vaguely, then asked about Jonas. Constance's tone shifted. She spoke of forbidding Merricat's wandering, of the need to settle down. When Merricat challenged the use of we, Constance turned to face her, confessing she'd been wrong to let them hide all these years. Uncle Julian should have been in a hospital, she said. They should have lived normal lives. She faltered, gesturing helplessly, then laughed at her own awkward suggestion that Merricat should have boyfriends. Merricat countered that she had Jonas, and the two of them dissolved into laughter that roused Uncle Julian to join in with his thin cackle. Calling Constance the silliest person she knew, Merricat went to search for Jonas, and found him sleeping among the lettuce plants. Charles returned, carrying a newspaper and wine along with their father's scarf, the one she'd used to tie the gate shut. He complained irritably about not being able to wear the expensive scarf, and Constance reminded him it had belonged to their father. Charles mentioned wanting to examine the rest of their father's clothes, then, after a pause, added that he ought to review their father's papers as well. There might be something important. Uncle Julian erupted, forbidding anyone to touch his papers, and Charles casually noted he hadn't even seen the study. Constance admitted it was unused, untouched, except for the safe, Charles observed. Uncle Julian insisted his papers must go to Constance after his death, and she agreed. Merricat was forbidden from opening the safe, and disliked the study anyway. She desperately hoped Constance wouldn't open it for Charles. He'd already taken their father's bedroom, his watch, his chain, his signet ring. She reflected on how exhausting it must be for Charles, playing the role of demon and ghost, always maintaining his disguise, never slipping, never betraying himself. She wondered if death would reveal his true form. When the afternoon cooled, and Constance prepared to bring Uncle Julian indoors, Maricat left Jonas sleeping among the lettuce, and returned to the house. The kitchen was warm and bright, with Constance peeling potatoes and Uncle Julian furiously organizing his papers. She announced Jonas was asleep in the lettuce. Constance joked about cat fur in the salad. Uncle Julian demanded a box for his papers, terrified that Charles would tamper with them. Constance went down to the cellar to fetch one, and Uncle Julian muttered to himself about William of Orange. When she returned with the box, he insisted again that Charles not touch his papers. Constance blamed herself, saying he belonged in a hospital, but Maricat argued it wouldn't be kind. Constance began to say something else. "But I'll have to if I," and stopped abruptly, turning back to the sink to ask about walnuts in the applesauce. Maricat sat in the sudden silence, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air, feeling time tighten around them like a vice. She thought again of smashing the hall mirror, but then Charles's heavy footsteps descended the stairs, and he strode into the kitchen, demanding to know what was for dinner. That evening, Constance played the harp in the drawing room, the instrument's curved silhouette casting shadows against their mother's portrait, while soft notes drifted through the air like flower petals. She played their mother's old songs, though Maricat noted that Constance's fingers drew a sweeter melody from the strings than she ever remembered hearing. Uncle Julian kept himself awake to listen, lost in reverie, and even Charles showed some restraint. He didn't dare put his feet on the furniture, though his pipe smoke curled upward toward the wedding cake ceiling, and he shifted restlessly during the music. Uncle Julian murmured about the delicate touch all Blackwood women possessed. Charles stopped by the fireplace to knock out his pipe, then picked up one of the Dresden figurines, asking if it was valuable. Constance said no, her mother had simply liked them. Uncle Julian began to request his favorite song, but Charles cut him off abruptly, announcing that he and Constance had plans to discuss. Thursday arrived, and Maricat knew it was the day to act against Charles. Constance had decided to bake spice cookies that morning, an unfortunate choice, Maricat thought, since no one realized Thursday would be their last ordinary day. Even Uncle Julian seemed unaware he felt stronger, and Constance brought him to the fragrant kitchen, where he continued organizing his papers into the box. Outside, Charles hammered noisily at the broken step. Though Maricat could see from the window he was doing a poor job, she took satisfaction in that, and wished the hammer would find his thumb instead. She waited until everyone was occupied, then slipped upstairs to their father's room, moving silently so Constance wouldn't notice. Her first task was to stop the watch Charles had started. She found it on the dresser, along with the chain and signet ring nestled among Charles's tobacco pouch, and matches. The matches she wasn't permitted to touch anyway. She lifted the watch and listened to its ticking, the sound of Charles's intrusion made audible. She wound the knob backward, until a small crack from within the mechanism silenced it forever, then set it back gently, certain she'd broken through his protective shell at last. The chain was already broken, and she had no use for the ring. She reasoned that if she could transform the room, and eventually the kitchen, the drawing room, the study, even the garden, Charles would find nothing familiar, and would have to accept that this was no longer the house he'd come to invade, forcing him to leave. She'd prepared the night before, gathering a basket of wood, sticks, leaves, glass, and metal scraps from the field and woods, with Jonas accompanying her in the darkness. Now she worked quickly and silently, removing books from the desk, blankets from the bed, replacing them with her collected debris. She carried the displaced belongings to the attic, where everything else of theirs was stored. She poured water over the mattress so Charles couldn't sleep there, and the mirror was already shattered so it wouldn't reflect him. She tore down the curtains, leaving him exposed to the view of the driveway leading away. Standing back, she surveyed the transformed room with satisfaction. A demon ghost would find himself utterly lost here. Back in her own room with Jonas, she heard Charles shouting from the garden. He'd abandoned the step repair. His hammer and board lay on the ground, and he was approaching from the creek carrying something. Constance came to the kitchen door, asking what had happened, while Uncle Julian demanded the young fool stop bellowing. Charles held up a box of silver dollars, Maricat's buried treasure. Constance recognized it immediately. recalling when Maricat had buried them, and Charles raged at the discovery, shaking the box violently. He couldn't believe the audacity. This was real money, $20 or $30, hidden away by a child with no right to it. Constance tried to calm him, explaining Maricat liked to bury things, but Charles demanded to know how much more was scattered across the property, possibly thousands of dollars they'd never find. Constance, distracted by Uncle Julian's calls, repeated that Maricat just liked to bury things and went inside. Charles followed, carrying the box tenderly toward the study. From the top of the stairs, Maricat watched him heading for their father's safe. She raced down and out through the kitchen, past Constance arranging cookies to cool. Alone by the creek, she imagined transforming Charles into a fly caught in a web, or wishing him dead, or nailing him to a tree until bark grew over his mouth. She stared at the hole he'd left unfilled, and pictured him discovering it, digging greedily, gasping at his find. She buried a round stone with a scratched face in the hole, laughing as she said goodbye to him. She stayed by the creek, refreshing her hiding place, clearing out old leaves and grass, washing her flat rock, replacing the branch across the entrance. When she finally returned to the house, Charles was still shouting in the kitchen, his voice growing thin and high. She sat on the step with Jonas, wondering if he'd eventually squeak, but he fell silent when he noticed her, lowering his voice to a slow, threatening tone. He hadn't decided what to do with her yet, he said, but she would remember it. Constance told him not to bully her, but her voice sounded strange, uncertain. Maricat tried to lighten the mood by reciting poisonous plants, but Charles ordered her to stop. Constance insisted she would have to explain herself, and the chill of that demand settled over Maricat. Charles sat at the table, turned to face her. Constance stood behind him against the sink. Uncle Julian stirred his papers nearby. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg from the rows of cooling cookies, but Maricat knew this was the last day, and Charles would never taste one. Charles had returned from upstairs carrying a handful of sticks and dirt, setting them on the kitchen table as evidence. Maricat watched him, sensing Constance's sadness at the mess on her clean surface. Charles demanded attention, but Uncle Julian complained he couldn't work with the noise. Charles turned his soft, threatening voice on both of them. One had fouled his room and buried money. The other couldn't even remember his name. Maricat, stroking Jonas's ears, asked Constance to save a spice cookie for Uncle Julian and one for Jonas. Charles demanded. She explained the mess in his room, but she saw no reason to answer him. He wasn't Constance, and any words might help him regain his grip on their house. Uncle Julian erupted, mistaking Charles for his brother John, declaring the quarrel between women was none of his affair, and men of dignity shouldn't involve themselves. Charles told him to shut up, then lowered his voice to tell Constance this was terrible, and she'd be better off out of it. Uncle Julian continued his rant about leaving John's house if that was what he wanted. Constance took all the blame, and Maricat sensed she was about to cry, an unthinkable prospect. Maricat called Charles evil, a ghost and demon, but Constance dismissed her words as nonsense. Uncle Julian accused Charles of being selfish and overly fond of worldly goods, and Charles declared the house was crazy. Constance promised to clean the room immediately if Charles would just stop being angry. Charles approached Uncle Julian's table, and the old man scrambled to protect his papers, calling him a bastard. Uncle Julian apologized to Constance for the language but insisted the young bastard stay away from his work. Charles claimed he'd had enough, that he wasn't touching the silly papers and wasn't John. Uncle Julian retorted that Charles wasn't tall enough by half an inch and should return to his father Arthur with the message his mother, a strong-willed woman who'd severed the family connection, could hear it too. Charles tried to remind him all that had been forgotten, but Uncle Julian told him to be quiet. Charles refused until he'd finished with Mary Catherine, and Uncle Julian declared Mary Catherine had been dead for a long time, died in an orphanage during her sister's trial. Charles pointed at Maricat, insisting she was sitting right there, but Uncle Julian dismissed her as unimportant to his book. When Uncle Julian told Charles to either be quiet or leave, Maricat laughed, and even Constance smiled. Charles stood frozen, and Uncle Julian muttered about an impertinent puppy before asking Constance why his papers were in a box. Had the young man touched them? Constance assured him no, and Uncle Julian asked when Charles was leaving. Charles said he wasn't, he was staying. Uncle Julian found that impossible. They didn't have the room and requested a chop for lunch, perhaps with a mushroom. Relieved, Constance began to clear the dirt from the table, and the tension dissolved. Charles looked baffled, unable to grasp anything firmly, and Maricat felt a surge of pride in Uncle Julian. Constance, now smiling, told Charles he looked tired and should rest until lunch. Charles demanded to know where he could rest, refusing to leave until something was done about the girl. Constance asked. Why, anything should be done. She'd clean the room. Charles wanted to know if she wouldn't even punish her, and Maricat, shivering against the doorframe, echoed the word, punish. Did he mean send her to bed without dinner? She ran, fleeing through the garden, until she reached the tall grass field, sitting in its center where the stalks rose above her head and hid her completely. Jonas found her, and they remained there together, invisible to the world. After a long time she rose and headed for the summer house, a place she hadn't visited in 6 years. Jonas refused to follow, disliking the structure, and went his own way. She remembered how no one had ever liked the summer house. Her father had planned it with a waterfall, but something had gone wrong in its construction, making it bad. Her mother had once seen a rat in the doorway and never returned, and no one else went there either. The ground around it was black and wet, unsuitable for burying things, and trees pressed too closely, breathing heavily on the roof. Flowers planted there had either died or grown wild and ugly. Standing before it, she thought it the ugliest place she'd ever seen. Her mother had once seriously asked to have it burned down. Inside it was wet and dark. She sat on the cold stone floor, arranging everyone mentally around the dining table, her father at the head, her mother at the foot, Uncle Julian and Thomas on either side of her mother, Aunt Dorothy and Constance beside her father. She placed herself between Constance and Uncle Julian, in her rightful spot, and slowly began to listen to their voices. They spoke of buying her a book, of giving her anything she wanted. They declared their love for her, insisted she must never be punished, that Mary Catherine would never allow herself to do anything wrong. They forbid sending her to bed without dinner, agreeing she must be guarded and cherished, that their most adored daughter should have anything she liked. The voices at the table continued their reverent chorus, instructing Thomas to give his dinner to Mary Catherine, commanding Dorothy and Julian to rise when their beloved daughter rose, commanding all heads bow to their adored Mary Catherine. But Maricat knew she had to return for dinner. It was unthinkable that Constance, Uncle Julian, and Charles would sit together without her, their conversation and passing of dishes proceeding while her place remained empty. Walking back through the gathering dusk with Jonas, she stopped to look at the house with all the love she possessed. A good house, soon to be cleaned and made fair again. She told Jonas she was looking at their home, and the cat stood quietly beside her, also looking up. The roof pointed firmly at the sky, the walls met compactly, and the windows shone dark. It was a good house, nearly clean, with lights spilling from the kitchen and dining room. She needed to be inside, with the door shut behind her. The moment she opened the kitchen door, she felt the anger still clinging to the house. Charles's voice carried on relentlessly, complaining that something must be done about her, that things couldn't continue this way. She felt sorry for Constance, having to listen endlessly while dinner grew cold. Jonas ran ahead into the dining room, and Constance announced Maricat's arrival. Standing in the doorway, Maricat took in the scene. Constance in pink, her hair neatly combed, smiling tiredly. Uncle Julian's wheelchair pressed against the table, his napkin tucked under his chin, a humiliation she regretted. He was eating meatloaf and peas, mashing them together with a spoon, oblivious to Charles's ongoing tirade. Charles addressed her directly, saying her tricks were over, and Constance agreed. They'd had enough of hiding and destruction. Constance gently told her to wash her face and comb her hair, not wanting her untidy at table when Charles was already angry. He pointed his fork at her, delivering his verdict, and Maricat wished he'd choke on it. Constance suggested she wash up, knowing Maricat wouldn't eat at the table and would get her dinner later in the kitchen, but Maricat understood Constance didn't want to give Charles another subject for complaint. She smiled and left, the voice still going behind her. The house had rarely heard so many words in recent years, and it would take time to clean them all out. She walked heavily up the stairs so they'd hear her going, but moved silently once out of sight. Constance had cleaned Charles's room, leaving it very empty. She'd merely removed things, having nothing to put back since Maricat had carried everything to the attic. The dresser drawers were empty, the closet bare, the bookshelves stripped. A broken watch and smashed chain sat alone on the dresser top. The wet bedding had been removed, and the mattress turned, the bed made up again. Charles had been lying there before dinner, his pipe still burned on the table beside the bed. She imagined him looking around the altered room, searching for something familiar, hoping for an angle of light or the closet's position to anchor him. She felt sorry Constance had to turn the mattress alone. The pink saucer with gold leaves, from a set older than anyone remembered, now held his pipe. She'd asked Constance about them once, learning they came from some great-grandmother's dowry, used and broken, and finally put away. Only these saucers and 3 dinner plates remained. They belonged in the pantry, not scattered through the house. One was in the drawing room, one in the dining room, one presumably in the study. Maricat brushed the saucer and pipe into the wastebasket, where they fell softly onto Charles's newspapers. She paused to wonder about her eyes. Her left eye saw golden, yellow, and orange. Her right saw blue, gray, and green. Perhaps one eye was for daylight and the other for night. If everyone saw differently, there might be new colors yet to be invented. She reached the stairs before remembering to wash and comb her hair. When she finally sat down, Charles demanded to know what had taken so long. She asked Constance for a cake with pink frosting and gold leaves, a party for her and Jonas. Constance said perhaps tomorrow. Charles insisted they'd have a long talk after dinner. Maricat recited a poisonous plant's name, and Constance identified it as deadly nightshade, asking Charles to let it wait. He said he'd had enough. Uncle Julian announced he'd cleaned his plate and asked what came next. Constance offered more, pleased to see him so hungry. He felt considerably better, hadn't felt so hearty for days. Maricat was glad he was well, and knew he was happy from having been discourteous to Charles. As Constance cut another piece of meatloaf, Uncle Julian fixed Charles with an evil shine in his old eyes, clearly preparing something wicked. But Charles suddenly turned his head, smelling smoke. Constance checked the stove. It wasn't the source. Charles confirmed the smoke was in the hall. He turned on Maricat, suspecting she was responsible, and she laughed at his obvious fear of going upstairs. Constance realized it was his pipe, and Charles fled upward, screaming a moment later with a sound like a blue jay's cry. Constance hurried to the hall as he crashed down the stairs, shouting that the whole house was on fire, and they had no phone. Uncle Julian announced he'd collect his papers and remove them to safety. Charles wrenched open the front door, telling Constance to grab the money and not to panic, then ran toward the village screaming, "Fire!" Constance seemed almost amused before taking Uncle Julian's chair to help him to his room. Maricat looked up the stairs and saw the door to their father's room standing open, flames moving inside. Fire burns upward. She thought it will burn their things in the attic. The front door stood open, and smoke trailed down the stairs and drifted outward. Maricat saw no need for panic. The fire seemed unhurried. She considered climbing up to shut the door to their father's room, trapping the flames inside where they belonged to Charles alone. But as she started up, a finger of flame reached for the hall carpet, and something heavy crashed in the room above. Nothing of Charles would remain now, even his pipe must be consumed. Constance appeared beside her, Uncle Julian's shawl over her arm, announcing he was gathering his papers. Maricat knew she was frightened, and suggested they wait on the porch, hidden behind the vines in the darkness. Constance protested. They'd just eaten the house. It had no right to burn, and began to shiver with what seemed like anger. Maricat took her hand and led her through the open door. As they turned back, lights flooded the driveway with sirens, and they stood frozen in the doorway's glare. Constance hid her face against Maricat, and Jim Donnell pushed past them into the house. Maricat guided Constance to the porch corner where the vines grew thick, holding her hand tightly as they watched the men's heavy boots cross their threshold, dragging hoses, bringing filth and danger. The house's front, never before lit at night, looked pale and exposed. Charles's voice cut through the noise, endlessly repeating his demand about the safe. Smoke pushed between the men entering. Maricat whispered to Constance not to watch them, assuring her no one could see them. They were all watching the fire. They only had to be quiet. Peering through the vines, Maricat saw rows of cars and the village fire engine. Everyone from the village gathered and watching. Some faces laughed. Others looked frightened. A voice nearby asked about the women, and the old man Charles called back. They'd had plenty of warning. Maricat thought Uncle Julian could manage his chair out the back door, and the fire seemed to be staying upstairs and in the front rooms. She couldn't reach the back door without crossing the light and being seen. Constance whispered Uncle Julian had been annoyed rather than frightened, and soon observed with a sigh how much scrubbing the hall would need. Maricat was glad she was thinking of the house. Jonas, Constance reported, had gone out the back door when she took Uncle Julian in for his papers. They were all right. Uncle Julian might even forget the fire if he got absorbed in his papers, and Jonas would be watching from the shadows. Constance grew quieter as more cars arrived and feet pattered endlessly across the doorsill. Jim Donnell was identifiable only by his chief hat. Everyone else blurred into anonymous faces laughing at the flames. Maricat tried to think clearly. The fire was Charles's, and the men seemed to be destroying it even as it ran through the house's bones. She could hear its singing heat upstairs, but the voices of firemen and onlookers smothered it. Constance stood quietly, sometimes watching, often covering her eyes. Voices rose above the din. A woman called out to let it burn. Charles shouted about the safe. A fireman waved and grinned, saying they had to put it out. Smoke thickened, hiding faces, and a crash from inside brought urgent voices and happy upturned faces. Charles again demanded men get the safe, insisting the whole house was going. The woman kept chanting for it to burn. Maricat was hungry and tired, wondering how long the fire would last. Village boys edged onto the porch but looked only inward, straining past the firemen. The light began to fade. The noise shifted inside. Voices grew surer, outside ones lower and disappointed. Someone announced it was going out, another said it was under control. They'd done a lot of damage, someone laughed, made a mess of the place. Someone else said it should have burned years ago, and with them in it. They mean us, Maricat thought. A voice asked if anyone had seen them. They'd been thrown out, no such luck. Too bad. The light faded further. Faces became shadows, and voices grew regretful. Jim Donnell emerged through the front door and announced the fire was out. He set his chief hat on the fire engine, picked up a rock, and in complete silence smashed it through the drawing room window. A wave of laughter rose, and the crowd surged forward like a wave at the house. Constance had her hands over her eyes. The other drawing room window crashed from inside the lamp from her chair. Laughter filled the air. Horrible. A Dresden figurine broke against the porch rail. Another rolled unbroken onto the grass. The harp fell with a musical cry. A chair smashed against a wall. Charles's voice asked for help with the safe. Then someone began the rhythmic chant about Maricat and tea, and Maricat retreated inside herself, begging to be on the moon. Dishes shattered, and she realized they were close, standing outside the dining room windows. She urged Constance to run, but Constance shook her head, hands over her face. Maricat pleaded with her, and pulled her away just as a window shattered, a chair thrown through it. Perhaps their father's chair. She dragged Constance toward the steps, no longer caring about silence. As they hit the light, Constance threw Uncle Julian's shawl across her face. A little girl ran out with something in her hands, her mother slapping her fingers and screaming not to put that in her mouth. Spice cookies scattered on the ground. The chant followed them. Maricat, said Constance, would you like a cup of tea? Would you like to go to sleep? Oh no, said Maricat, you'll poison me. They had to reach the woods, but the headlights blazed across the lawn. They hesitated at the steps, and more cars arrived. Jim Clark demanding to know what was happening, his wife staring open-mouthed. Jim pushed through the crowd into the house, shouting about crazy drunken fools. Dr. Levy hurried toward the house. Inside, laughter erupted again at the tea chant, and someone suggested tearing it down brick by brick. The doctor pushed past them without seeing, asking where Julian Blackwood was. A woman answered he was 10 feet deep in the boneyard. Maricat took Constance's hand tightly and started down the steps slowly, careful not to let her fall. Only Helen Clark saw them, staring at the house. Behind them, Jim Clark tried to drive people out. Then a voice, Stella's, she thought, shouted, "There they were," and the crowd closed in. Constance held the shawl across her face, and they stood pressed together, surrounded. Someone suggested putting them back in the house and starting the fire again. Others said they'd fix things up nicely. The chant continued. For a terrible moment, Maricat thought they would join hands and dance. She saw Helen Clark pressed against her car, crying, and even without hearing the words, she knew she was saying she wanted to go home. They kept moving, blocked at every turn. Whenever Maricat tried to escape the circle, the people fell back just enough to let her hope, then closed in again. She saw Harler wandering across the porch, collecting things into a pile. She pulled Constance toward the trees, but Jim Donnell's wife and Mrs. Mueller blocked them, laughing with outstretched arms. She tried again, but Stella and the Harris boys crossed in front of them, the boys shouting their chant. She turned toward the house, but Albert and his wife were there, almost dancing as they held their hands up to stop them. She tried the side, and Jim Donnell stepped in front of them, reciting the poison verse with exaggerated politeness. The circle tightened, the laughter drowning out everything. Constance kept the shawl pressed to her face with one hand, clinging to Maricat with the other. Maricat spotted an opening and ran for the trees, but all the Harris boys were there, one rolling on the ground with laughter. She turned back toward the house, but Stella blocked them again. Constance was stumbling, and Maricat knew she couldn't let her fall in front of them. Then Jim Clark's voice cut through from the porch, quiet, but commanding, telling them that was enough. A brief silence followed, broken by someone's defiant chant, and the laughter swelled again. Jim Clark raised his voice, announcing that Julian Blackwood was dead. The crowd fell silent. Charles's voice asked from somewhere if she had killed him. The people withdrew slowly, step by step, until a wide, clear space opened around them, with Constance standing visible, the shawl still covering her face. Charles repeated his question, and the doctor answered from the doorway she had not. Julian had died as he'd always expected, having waited a long time. Jim Clark began ushering people away, pushing shoulders and turning them toward their cars, telling them to go quickly, because there had been a death in the house. In the sudden quiet, Maricat heard Helen Clark murmur about poor Julian. She took a cautious step toward the darkness, pulling Constance with her. The doctor mentioned something about the heart, and she took another step. No one looked at them. Car doors closed softly, engines started. Glancing back, Maricat saw a small group around the doctor on the steps. Most of the lights were heading down the driveway. When the shadow of the trees fell over them, she moved quickly. One last step, and they were inside the woods. Her feet left the grass, and found the soft moss of the path, the trees closing around them. She stopped and put her arms around Constance, telling her it was all over, that everything was all right now. She knew her way in darkness or light. She was glad she'd freshened her hiding place. It would be pleasant for Constance. She would cover her with leaves like children in a story, keep her safe and warm, bring her bright fruits and water in a leaf cup. Someday, they would go to the moon. She led Constance into the shelter, guided her to the corner with its fresh leaves and blanket, gently pushed her down, and took the shawl from her, covering her with it. Jonas purred from the corner. She placed branches across the entrance so even lights wouldn't reveal them. It wasn't entirely dark. She could see Constance's shadow, and when she tilted her head back, 2 or 3 stars shone through the leaves. One of their mother's Dresden figurines was broken, she thought, and then told Constance aloud that she would put death in all their food and watch them die. Constance stared in the leaves and asked if she meant the way she had done before. It had never been spoken of in 6 years. Maricat answered yes, the way she had done before. An ambulance came in the night to take Uncle Julian away. Maricat wondered if they missed his shawl, wrapped around Constance as she slept. She watched the ambulance lights turn into the driveway, heard the gentle voices speaking in the presence of the dead, the doors opening and closing. They called out a few times, perhaps to ask about Uncle Julian, but no one came into the woods. She sat by the creek, wishing she'd been kinder to him. He had believed she was dead, and now he was dead himself. She thought of the dinner table, and wondered what kind of house they would have now. Perhaps the fire had destroyed everything, and they'd returned to find the past 6 years burned away, the family waiting around the table. Perhaps they'd be in the Rochester house, or living in the village, or on a houseboat, or in a tower. Perhaps the fire could be reversed, destroying the village. Instead, perhaps the villagers were all dead now. Perhaps the village was a game board, and she'd pass the fire square, with only one move left to reach home. Jonas's fur smelled of smoke. Today was Helen Clark's tea day, but there would be no tea. They had to neaten the house, even though it wasn't the usual day. She wished Constance had made sandwiches. She wondered if Helen Clark would come despite the house being unready, and decided she would not be allowed to hand teacups anymore. When the first light came, Merricat heard Constance stirring, and went to be near her as she woke. Constance opened her eyes, looked at the trees, then at Merricat, and smiled. Merricat told her they were on the moon at last. Constance had thought it was all a dream, but Merricat assured her it had really happened. Constance mourned. Poor Uncle Julian. But Merricat said they'd stayed on the moon while he was taken away. Constance was glad to be there, and thanked Merricat for bringing her. Leaves were in her hair, dirt on her face, and Jonas stared at her in surprise. He'd never seen Constance dirty. She fell quiet, realizing her state, then asked what they were going to do. Merricat said they must neaten the house, even though it wasn't the usual day. Constance echoed the word house with dismay, and Merricat added that she'd had no dinner the night before. She scrambled up, untangling herself from the shawl and leaves, her voice full of concern for Merricat as she promised they would hurry. Merricat suggested she wash her face first, and Constance went to the creek to scrub with her wet handkerchief, while Merricat shook out and folded Uncle Julian's shawl. Everything felt strange and backward that morning. She had never touched the shawl before, and already she could sense that the rules were different. She made a mental note to return later and clean the hiding place, replacing the leaves with fresh ones. Constance worried she would starve, but Merricat took her hand to slow her, warning they needed to move quietly and carefully. Some of them might still be waiting. She led the way down the path, silent, with Constance and Jonas following. Constance couldn't match her stealth but made little sound, and Jonas made none at all. She took the path that emerged near the vegetable garden at the back of the house, stopping at the wood's edge to hold Constance back while they scanned for any lingering presence. For a moment, everything seemed normal, the garden, the kitchen door, and then Constance gasped, a small moan escaping her. Merricat froze, because the top of their house was gone. She remembered standing the day before, looking at it with love, how tall it had always been, reaching into the trees. Now it ended above the kitchen, in a nightmare of black twisted wood. She spotted part of a window frame still holding broken glass. Her window, the one she'd looked out from her room. No one was there, no sound. They moved slowly toward the house, taking in its ugliness and ruin. Ash had drifted among the vegetables. The lettuce and tomatoes would need washing. The fire hadn't reached the ground floor, contenting itself with the bedrooms and attic, but everything grass, apple trees. The marble bench bore an air of smokiness and dirt. Constance hesitated at the kitchen door, then lifted the latch she'd lifted 1,000 times before. The house seemed to shiver as she pushed it open, but no timber crashed down, no sudden dissolution followed. Constance stood in the doorway, her hand against the frame for support, repeating that it was her kitchen. Merricat noted her stool was still there. The door had been obstructed by the overturned kitchen table. She set it upright, and they entered. The floor was littered with broken dishes, glasses, torn boxes of food, ripped paper. Jars of jam and syrup had been shattered against the walls. The sink brimmed with broken glass, as if each piece had been methodically smashed. Drawers of silverware had been pulled out and broken, generations of Blackwood wedding silver bent and scattered. Tablecloths and napkins, hemmed and cherished by Blackwood women, had been ripped from the sideboard and dragged through the kitchen. All their hidden treasure had been found and soiled. The little sugar bowl with roses lay near Merricat's feet, its handles gone. Constance picked up a silver spoon, identifying it as their grandmother's wedding pattern, and set it on the table. She turned to the cellar door closed, untouched, and descended a few steps, reporting with relief that nothing there had been disturbed. She washed her hands at the sink, dried them on a dish towel from the floor, and announced she would make breakfast. Jonah sat on the doorstep, staring at the kitchen with astonishment. Merricat wondered if he thought they had made this mess. She found an unbroken cup and set it on the table, then began searching for other survivors. Constance returned from the cellar with jars of vegetable soup, strawberry jam, chicken soup, and pickled beef, setting them on the table with something like triumph. She discovered the flour, salt, and potatoes had been overlooked, but the sugar was gone. The floor was gritty with it, and Merricat imagined them throwing handfuls, screaming about Blackwood sugar. The pantry shelves had been raided for cereals, spices, and canned food, but Constance found a loaf of bread, and the cooler still held eggs, milk, and butter. Merricat found 3 unbroken chairs and arranged them around the table. Jonah sat on her stool in the corner, watching. She drank chicken soup from a handleless cup while Constance washed a knife for buttering bread. Time and order had dissolved. She couldn't remember whether she'd found the chairs before or after eating. Constance started toward Uncle Julian's door, then turned back with a small smile, saying she thought she'd heard him waking. They hadn't yet explored beyond the kitchen, and they sat quietly, grateful for the chairs and soup and sunlight, not ready to go further. Merricat asked what would happen to Uncle Julian. Constance said there would be a funeral, like the others. The Clarks, the Carringtons, little Mrs. Wright would attend, telling each other how sorry they were, looking to see if the sisters were there. Merricat felt them looking and shivered. Constance said they would bury him with the others. Merricat wanted to bury something for him. Constance reflected that Uncle Julian was gone, most of the house was gone, and they were all that was left. Merricat added Jonas. Constance said they would lock themselves in more securely than ever. Merricat reminded her it was Helen Clark's tea day, and Constance said no, not again, not here. The library books remained untouched on their shelf. Perhaps no one wanted to risk fines. Constance sat motionless, hands spread on the table, almost dreaming, as if she didn't quite believe she'd woken. Merricat said they must neaten the house, and Constance smiled across at her. When Merricat couldn't wait any longer, she announced she was going to look and went to the dining room door. She opened it to a shocking smell of wetness, burned wood, and destruction. Glass from the tall windows lay across the floor. The silver tea service had been stamped into unrecognizable shapes. Chairs were broken here too, hurled at windows and walls. She passed through into the front hall, where the front doors stood wide open and early sunlight fell on broken glass and torn cloth. The drawing room drapes their mother had made 14 feet long. Outside, the lawn was marked with tire tracks and footprints. The front porch was littered, and she remembered Harler's neat pile of broken furniture from the night before. She waited, ensuring no one was watching, then ran to find their mother's Dresden figurine, unbroken where it had hidden among the roots of a bush. She brought it to Constance, who held it against her cheek and said it was all her fault somehow. Merricat declared her love, asked for the promised cake with pink frosting and gold leaves. Constance shook her head, then took a breath and stood up, saying first she would clean the kitchen. Merricat asked what she would do with the figurine, and Constance said she would put it back where it belonged. She followed Constance through the hall to the drawing room doorway. The hall was less littered, but still held fragments of spoons and dishes. The drawing room shocked her. Their mother's portrait looked down graciously while the room lay destroyed. The white trim was blackened with smoke and soot, never to be clean again. The rose brocade chairs were torn and dirty, smudged with wet footprints. The harp had been pushed over. Merricat remembered its cry as it fell. The windows were broken, the drapes torn down, leaving them exposed to the outside. Merricat told Constance she could close the shutters and step through the broken window onto the porch. No one had ever come this way before. She found the rusted hooks easily. The shutter swung closed with a shake. She could only reach the lower bolt, leaving the upper ones for another night, perhaps with a ladder. After closing the tall drawing room windows, she went along the porch and in through the front door to where Constance stood in the dimness. Constance placed the Dresden figurine back on the mantel below their mother's portrait, and for one brief moment the shadowy room came together as it should, then fell apart forever. They walked carefully through the broken things on the floor. Their father's safe lay just inside the drawing-room door, unopened, and impossible to carry further. Constance touched it with her toe, calling it foolishness. Their mother had always loved having her drawing-room admired, but now no one could look in through the shuttered windows, and no one would ever see it again. They closed the drawing-room door behind them, and never opened it afterward. Maricat went onto the porch to close the dining-room shutters while Constance waited inside, and then they shut and locked the front door, safe at last. The hall was dark, with only narrow slivers of sunlight coming through the glass panels on either side of the door. They could look out, but no one could see in, the hall inside too dark. Above them, the stairs led into blackness and burned rooms with tiny patches of sky showing through. Maricat closed her mind against the thought of silent winged creatures perching on the broken rafters, peering down. She considered barricading the stairs, but a soaked, dirty mattress already lay halfway down, marking where the firemen had stood. She looked up, wondering where the walls and floors and beds and attic boxes had gone. Their father's watch burned, their mother's tortoiseshell set destroyed. A breath of air touched her cheek, smelling of smoke and ruin. Their house was a castle, turreted, and open to the sky. Constance called her back to the kitchen, unable to stay in the hall. Like children hunting for shells, they shuffled across the kitchen floor, turning over debris to find things still whole and useful. They gathered a little pile on the table, 2 cups with handles, several without, half a dozen plates, 3 bowls. All the cans of food were undamaged. The spices went back on their shelf. They found most of the silverware and straightened it, returning it to its drawers. Maricat claimed a green cup with a pale yellow inside. Constance chose a white cup with orange flowers, matching one of the plates. She remembered using those dishes when she was very small, the everyday china, before their mother bought new best china, relegating the white and gold to everyday use and the flowered set to the pantry shelf. They would take their meals like ladies, Constance said, using cups with handles. After removing everything they wanted, Constance swept the rubble into the dining room and cleared the hall so they could move from kitchen to front door without passing through. They closed the dining room doors and never opened them again. Maricat thought of the Dresden figurine standing small and courageous in the dark drawing room, and remembered they would never dust it again. Before Constance swept away the torn drapes, Maricat asked for a piece of the cord with a gold tassel, thinking it might be the right thing to bury for Uncle Julian. When they finished, the kitchen floor scrubbed clean. The house looked new. The front door was locked, the kitchen door locked and bolted. They sat at the table drinking milk from their 2 cups while Jonas drank from his pan, and then the knocking started at the front door. Constance fled to the cellar stairs, and Maricat followed after checking the kitchen bolt. They sat in the darkness, listening to the knocking and Helen Clark's voice calling for them. Constance whispered it was Helen, and Maricat wondered if she'd come for her tea. "Never again," Constance said. Helen came around to the kitchen door, shaking the handle and insisting she could see something cooking on the stove. She pleaded for them to open up, wanting them to come to her house. Jim Clark told her to leave them alone, that they'd come out when ready. Helen insisted they couldn't be left alone, that Constance took things too seriously. Jim refused to break down the door. Maricat whispered to Constance about covering the kitchen windows so they wouldn't have to hide on the cellar stairs whenever Helen came pounding. Constance, annoyed, wished Helen would hurry, her soup was going to boil over. Helen called and called, going back to the car, her voice fading as if she expected them to materialize from the woods. When the car started, they emerged, and Constance turned off the soup while Maricat checked the front door. She watched the car leave and thought she could still hear Helen calling. Maricat commented that Helen certainly wanted her tea, and Constance observed they only had 2 cups with handles. She would never take tea here again. Maricat said it was fortunate Uncle Julian was gone, or one of them would have to use a broken cup, and asked if Constance was going to neaten his room. Constance turned from the stove and asked the question that hung over them. What were they going to do? Maricat listed what they'd already done: neatened the house, had food hidden from Helen, and echoed the question back. What were they going to do? They stood in the wreckage of the kitchen, facing the bare facts of their survival. Practical questions hung in the air between them: where they would rest, how they would mark the hours, what they would wear. Constance voiced these concerns with a tremor of worry, while her sister dismissed the need for timekeeping with a shrug, though she acknowledged the deeper truth that even their preserve stores would not last indefinitely. The younger sister offered the creekside shelter as a solution, a familiar refuge she knew intimately, but Constance rejected the idea with a firmness that surprised her. That place served well enough for hiding, she insisted, but they required a proper bed. The younger sister remembered a mattress on the stairway, salvaged from her own former room, and proposed dragging it down despite the burn on one corner. Constance agreed readily, and they moved together to retrieve it. Working in awkward tandem, they pulled the waterlogged, grimy mattress through the hallway, trailing splinters and fragments of broken glass across the floor. They hauled it through the kitchen to the back door, and before unlatching it, the younger sister checked outside with care. Even after the door swung open, she stepped out first, scanning the grounds thoroughly before signaling that the coast was clear. They dragged the mattress onto the lawn, positioning it in the sun near their mother's old marble bench. She noted the spot where their uncle used to sit, and her sister agreed that the day would have suited him perfectly. The younger sister wondered aloud whether he had been warm at the end, whether perhaps the sun had touched him one last time. Her sister admitted she had taken his shawl, and hoped he had not needed it in his final moments. Then Constance announced her intention to plant something in that very place, a yellow flower, and her sister promised to bury something yellow as well, to keep him warm. Constance touched the grass softly, already envisioning it, and when the younger sister observed that a flower in the middle of the lawn would look strange, Constance replied that its meaning would be known only to them. Then, with a gentle command, she directed her sister to fetch water and scrubbed the mattress clean while she attended to the kitchen floor again. A sense of settled happiness settled over the younger sister as she surveyed the work ahead. Though Constance remained pale, the kitchen bore the marks of her relentless effort. Shelves scrubbed, table washed repeatedly, windows and floors gleaming. Their salvaged dishes stood bravely on a shelf, and rescued canned goods and unbroken boxes formed a substantial row in the pantry. She teased her sister about training the cat to catch rabbits for stew, and Constance laughed, doubting the creature could manage even a grasshopper with his pampered tastes. When the younger sister dismissed the notion of grasshopper stew, Constance announced she was making an onion pie instead. While her sister scrubbed, she found a heavy cardboard carton and dismantled it carefully, producing large panels to cover the kitchen door's glass window. From the tool shed she retrieved the hammer and nails left behind by their unwanted cousin, and she fastened the cardboard across the door until the glass was entirely concealed. She repeated the process on the 2 kitchen windows, plunging the room into darkness. When she suggested that simply letting the windows grow dirty would have achieved the same safety, Constance recoiled at the very idea of living with unclean glass. The kitchen was clean now, but it could not sparkle without light, and she knew her sister was not pleased. Her sister loved brightness and airy cooking spaces. She proposed leaving the door open as a compromise, keeping watch at all times, listening for approaching cars, and promised to devise barricades along the house's sides to prevent anyone from reaching the back. Her sister agreed that Helen Clark would certainly try again, but the younger sister took comfort that at least the woman could no longer peer inside. The afternoon deepened, and even with the door open, sunlight crept only a short way across the floor. The cat came to Constance at the stove, asking for his evening meal. The kitchen felt warm and familiar and clean. For a fleeting moment, the younger sister imagined a fireplace, sitting beside a fire, but the thought curdled when she remembered the flames they had already endured. She announced she would check the front door and found it locked, the grounds outside empty. Returning to the kitchen, she learned that Constance planned to clean their uncle's room the next day, determined to keep what little remained of the house immaculate. When the younger sister asked if Constance would sleep there, her sister said no. She wanted the younger sister to take that bed, as it was the only one left. The younger sister recoiled, insisting she was not permitted in that room, and even after Constance pointed out that their uncle was gone, she held firm. She wanted the mattress she had salvaged from her own old bed on the floor in her own familiar corner. Constance laughed at her stubbornness, noting the mattress would not dry before tomorrow anyway, and the uncle's bed remained unclean. The younger sister offered to bring branches and leaves from the creekside shelter, but Constance protested at the thought of her clean kitchen floor being covered with debris. She agreed to fetch the blanket and the uncle's shawl instead. Constance expressed concern about her going out so far alone, but the younger sister reassured her that no one was outside, that the darkness would protect her, and that she would take the cat for safety. She ran through the gathering dusk, the cat easily outpacing her and waiting when she arrived at her hiding place. The run felt good, and returning to see the kitchen door open and the warm light spilling out felt even better. Once inside, she bolted the door behind her, sealing them in for the night. Her sister spoke warmly from the stove, pleased with the dinner she had prepared, and invited her to sit. With the door shut, Constance had switched on the ceiling light, and their mismatched dishes were arranged neatly on the table. She mentioned polishing the silverware the next day and gathering more from the garden, though the younger sister noted the lettuce remained coated in ash. Constance acknowledged the problem and added that she would think of curtains to conceal the ugly cardboard covering the windows. Her sister, in turn, promised to build the side barricades and to tell the time by guess alone. Then, from the front of the house, came the sound of a car stopping. They fell silent, exchanging a glance loaded with uncertainty. She rose quickly to check that the kitchen door was bolted, confident the cardboard prevented anyone from seeing in. Knocking began at the front door, brief and perfunctory, as if the callers knew they would not be welcome there. Soon footsteps stumbled around the side of the house, the darkness making their progress awkward. She recognized the voice of Jim Clark, and another she placed as the doctor's. Clark complained. He could see nothing, the night black as sin, while the doctor noted a sliver of light at one of the windows. Her stomach clenched, wondering which window had betrayed them. Clark was certain they were inside, and the doctor expressed concern that they might be hurt or sick, shut up and needing help. Clark added that he was supposed to bring them home. The voices drew nearer to the back door, and Constance reached across the table, her hand seeking reassurance. If the visitors managed to see inside, they would have to flee to the cellar. Then Clark exclaimed that the place was all boarded up, and a surge of relief washed through her. She had forgotten the real boards in the tool shed, sturdier than her makeshift cardboard. The doctor called out politely, identifying himself, and Clark added his name, reminding them of Helen's worry. They asked if the sisters were hurt or sick, offered help, invited them to come to their house. The doctor's voice softened, friendly and quiet, promising no one would hurt them. He emphasized they had come as friends, wanting only to be certain the sisters were all right. He offered a deal if they would just say a single word confirm they were safe. The callers would promise never to bother them again. Clark insisted they could not simply let people worry. The doctor pressed again, asking only for one word to set their minds at ease. They waited, and she could feel them leaning close to the glass, straining to see inside. Across the table, Constance allowed a small smile, and she returned it. Their safeguards were holding the visitors could not see in. The doctor raised his voice slightly, delivering the news of the uncle's funeral the next day. Clark added that there were many flowers from the families, from the Wrights and the Carringtons, and suggested the sisters might feel differently about their friends if they could see such tributes. She wondered at that, how seeing flowers heaped on their dead uncle would alter anything. Uncle Julian buried beneath that floral weight would bear no resemblance to the uncle she had known every day. Perhaps the flowers would warm him even in death, though she tried to picture him dead and could only summon the image of him sleeping. She imagined the families pouring armfuls of blossoms onto the helpless old man. Then Clark warned that driving away friends gained him nothing, and mentioned something Helen had instructed him to convey. But the words faded as she withdrew into the safety of their sealed kitchen. The visitors pressed against the door, their voices straining with a mix of impatience and forced concern. One of them insisted no one would bother them if they would just confirm they were all right, while the other warned that repeated visits could not continue indefinitely. There was only so much patience friends could offer. The cat yawned in the stillness. Her sister turned with exaggerated care back to her place at the table and lifted a buttered biscuit, taking the smallest, quietest bite imaginable. The sight struck her as absurdly comic, like a doll mechanically performing the motions of eating, and she clapped her hands over her mouth to stifle the laughter bubbling up. The man outside swore and knocked again, his frustration palpable. The doctor made a final plea, acknowledging they knew the sisters were inside, but his words faltered as Clark urged him to give up, declaring the effort not worth the shouting. The doctor's voice dropped, his mouth likely pressed against the door, issuing a grim prediction one day they would need help, be sick or injured, and then they would be quick enough to answer. Clark cut him off, ordering them to leave the sisters be. Footsteps retreated around the side of the house, and she held perfectly still, wondering if this was some trick of feigned departure followed by silent return, the men waiting in the darkness just beyond the door. The image twisted in her mind, her sister eating that silent biscuit inside, the man listening just outside, a world where noise itself might be extinguished forever. Then the car engine started from the front of the house, and the sound of it driving away broke the spell. Her sister set her fork down with a small clatter, and she exhaled, finally able to ask aloud where the uncle had been taken. Her sister answered absently, "The same place in the city," but then her gaze sharpened and she spoke with sudden urgency, wanting to apologize for her wickedness the previous night. A cold stillness seized her as the memory surfaced. Her sister said she should never have reminded her of the reasons everyone died, and she cut her off sharply, unwilling to be pulled back into that darkness. Her sister pressed on, wanting her to forget the whole thing, insisting she had never intended to speak of it, and regretted doing so. She stated flatly that she had put the poison in the sugar. Her sister admitted she had always known, that she had never used sugar herself. That was precisely why she had chosen it, she replied. A long sigh from her sister, and then a promise they would never speak of it again. The chill lingered, but the kind smile that followed made everything feel right again. She declared her love, and her sister returned the words with equal warmth. The cat settled on the floor, and she thought how much easier it should have been to find comfort here. Her sister deserved soft leaves and moss beneath her blanket, but they could not dirty the kitchen floor again. She arranged her own blanket in her familiar corner near the stool, and the cat claimed that perch, looking down at her. Her sister lay near the stove, her pale face just visible across the darkened room. She asked if she was comfortable, and her sister laughed softly, noting she had spent countless hours in this kitchen but never lying on its floor. The floor had been so well cared for over the years, she mused, that it owed her a comfortable night. She promised to bring in lettuce the next day. Slowly, a new rhythm of days took shape around them, settling into what felt like happiness. Each morning she woke and immediately walked the hall to check the front door's lock. They moved through the earliest hours, when the grounds were always empty. With the gates now open and the path available to anyone, children had begun appearing. From the narrow glass pane beside the door, she watched them playing on the front lawn, their movements stiff and their voices hushed, as if they were not quite sure of their purpose. Perhaps they were only pretending to play, sent by parents to explore or to spy. She studied them, convinced they were unconvincing children, their actions graceless, and their gazes fixed studiously away from the house. She wondered how long before they crept onto the porch, pressing their faces against the shutters. Her sister joined her, looking over her shoulder, and she announced that these were strangers' children without faces. Her sister noted that they had eyes. She dismissed them as birds, creatures that could not see them, would never see them, though they did not yet know it. Her sister supposed they would return, but she was certain the strangers would come and go without ever glimpsing inside, and then she asked for breakfast. The kitchen stayed dark until she unbolted the door and let the sun in. The cat took his spot on the step, washing himself, and her sister sang while cooking. After eating, she sat on the step with the cat while her sister washed up. The barricades around the house proved easier than expected. She finished them in a single night, working by flashlight while her sister held it steady. On both sides, where trees and bushes already narrowed the path, she heaped broken boards and furniture from the pile left by the junk dealer. The barricades would not stop anyone determined, but they would make enough noise to give them time to bolt the kitchen door. She had also hammered boards across the kitchen door's glass. Though she disliked how visible the clumsy side barricades were, she wondered if she might try mending the broken step. Her sister asked what she was laughing at, and she admitted that their moon was not quite what she had imagined, but a happy place nonetheless. Her sister set breakfast on the table and urged that they bring in more food from the garden, uneasy at the thought of it waiting for them. She promised to bring back everything from cinnamon to cabbages, and her sister added rhubarb. They could leave the kitchen door open while working the garden, keeping watch on the barricades, ready to retreat if needed. She carried the basket while they gathered lettuce still gray with ash, radishes, tomatoes, cucumbers, and later berries and melons. She disliked eating anything still dirty, though most soot had blown away, and the garden air had cleared, but the smoke had seeped into the ground and would always remain. As soon as they were settled, her sister opened the uncle's room and cleaned it, washing the bedding and hanging it to dry. When she asked what would become of the uncle's papers, her sister hesitated, then decided to keep them in the box, preserved in the cellar, so the uncle would know his work was respected. She went to check the front door again. The children were still on the lawn, playing their strange, silent games, never looking at the house. People used the path freely now, walking where only her feet had once touched, and she suspected most of them came only out of some grim compulsion to prove they could, while only the most defiant returned. She dreamed away the afternoon on the doorstep, the cat asleep beside her, watching the peaceful garden. Her sister emerged with an armful of the uncle's clothes, 2 suits, a topcoat, a hat. She remembered that he had once walked upright, and her sister recalled him buying one of those suits years ago. She wondered what he had worn on that last evening. What tie? Surely something he would want remembered. Her sister considered this, and replied that when she had claimed him from the hospital, he had been in pajamas and a robe. Perhaps he should have one of the suits now, she suggested, but her sister thought he had likely been buried in one of the neighbor's old suits instead. She started for the cellar, then stopped, turning back. Her sister pointed out the stark reality. The uncle's clothes were all that remained in the house, everything else having burned, including her own things and the younger sister's. The younger sister noted that everything in the attic had been lost as well. Her sister gestured to her pink dress, the only garment she had left, and the younger sister looked down at her own brown dress, which her sister declared in need of washing and mending, scolding her gently for tearing it so badly. The younger sister proposed a suit of woven leaves with acorn buttons, but her sister insisted they would have to wear the uncle's clothes. The younger sister refused, citing some prohibition against touching his things, and instead imagined a moss lining for winter and a hat of bird feathers. Her sister laughed at her, saying such fantasies might work on the moon, but not in their house, and firmly stated she would be wearing one of the uncle's old shirts and perhaps his trousers. The younger sister resisted again, and her sister sighed, conceding that at least she would see her wearing them. Then she paused, laughed, and looked at the younger sister with a sudden shift in mood. The younger sister asked what was happening, and her sister, still laughing, set the uncle's clothes aside and went to the pantry, opening a drawer. The younger sister remembered what lay inside and laughed too. Her sister returned with an armload of tablecloths, presenting them as a solution. She held up options 1 with a yellow border, a red and white check, and damask that would be too stiff and already darned. The younger sister stood and pressed the red and white check against herself, suggesting her sister cut a hole for her head. Her sister admitted she had no sewing supplies, so the cloth would have to be tied with a cord or worn as a toga. The younger sister claimed the damask for a cloak, delighted by the absurdity, but her sister's laughter faded, and she dropped the cloth, pulling the younger sister into an embrace, mourning aloud what she had brought them to: no house, no food, her baby dressed in a tablecloth like a rag doll. The younger sister held her and declared they would be happy, repeating it until her sister quieted. She dressed at once, not giving her sister time to dwell on it. She chose the red and white check, and her sister cut a hole for her head. She tied her gold cord with a tassel around her waist as a belt and felt she looked quite fine. Her sister was sad at first, turning away and scrubbing furiously at the brown dress in the sink, but she danced in her new robe, and soon her sister smiled and laughed again. She compared herself to Robinson Crusoe, but noted Crusoe had no gay cloths with a gold belt. Her sister admitted she had never looked so bright, and she replied that she preferred her tablecloth to her sister's skins of Uncle Julian. Her sister identified the cloth as one used for summer breakfasts on the lawn years ago, never in the dining room. She declared she would be a summer breakfast one day, a formal dinner the next, but her sister cut her off, noting her fine gown and dirty face, reminding her they still had clean water and a comb. One lucky thing about the uncle's room, she persuaded her sister to bring out his wheeled chair and push it through the garden to reinforce the barricade. The sight of her sister wheeling the empty chair was strange, and for a moment she tried to picture the uncle sitting there, hands folded, but all that remained were worn spots on the chair and a handkerchief tucked under the cushion. The chair would serve as a powerful guardian, staring at intruders with a dead uncle's blank menace. She worried that Uncle Julian might vanish entirely. His papers in a box, his chair on the barricade, his toothbrush thrown away, even his smell gone from his room. But her sister planted a yellow rose bush on his spot, and one night she went to the creek and buried his initialed gold pencil by the water, so the creek would always speak his name. The cat began going into the uncle's room, where he had never gone before, but she did not enter. Helen Clark came twice more, knocking and calling, begging them to answer, but they sat quietly. When she could not get around the house because of the barricade, she announced from the front door that she would not return, and she kept her word. One evening, as they ate dinner, a soft knock came at the front door, too gentle for Helen Clark. She hurried silently down the hall, her sister following, and they pressed against the door, listening. A low voice outside asked for Miss Constance and Miss Mary Catherine, and they heard him moving his head, checking that he was unseen. He announced he had brought a chicken his wife had roasted, along with cookies and a pie, and apologized for breaking one of their chairs. He set the basket on the step and left quietly. Her sister's eyes were wide with wonder. They stared at each other. They finished dinner and waited until full darkness. Then she opened the door and brought the basket inside. Her sister examined the blueberry pie, still warm, the chicken wrapped in a napkin, the package of cookies, touching everything with gentle care. She noted the food was still warm, wondered if the woman had made 2 pies and kept one for her own house, and criticized the cookies for not being crisp enough. When she offered to return the basket, her sister stopped her, not until she had washed the napkins, concerned what the woman would think of her. So began a regular pattern. Sometimes they received home cured bacon, fruit, preserves that never matched her sister's, roasted chicken, cakes, pies, cookies, potato salad, coleslaw, beef stew that her sister dismantled and reconstructed, baked beans, macaroni. Her sister remarked they were the biggest church supper anyone had ever had. The offerings came silently, always in the evenings. They imagined the men coming home from work to find baskets ready, perhaps coming in darkness to hide their shame from each other. Her sister could identify the cooks by their recipes. One used too much ketchup, another too much molasses. Occasionally a note accompanied the food, an apology for the dishes. The curtains, the harp, they always returned the baskets to the doorstep, never opening the front door until full darkness, and she always checked afterward that the lock held. She was no longer allowed to go to the creek. Uncle Julian was there, and it was too far from her sister. She never went beyond the edge of the woods, and her sister only as far as the vegetable garden. She could not bury anything more, nor touch stone. Every day she inspected the boards across the kitchen windows, nailing more over any cracks. Every morning she checked the front door lock, and every morning her sister washed the kitchen. They spent long afternoons at the front door, each with a peephole through the cardboard-covered glass panels, watching the children play and the people walk by, strangers all, with staring eyes and open mouths. One afternoon a group came by bicycle, 2 women, a man, and 2 children. They parked in the driveway and lay on the front lawn pulling at the grass. The children ran up and down. One woman observed that the vines now almost hid the burn marks on the roof. Another said the house now looked like a tomb. The first woman mentioned the fine staircase, carved in Italy, but the second woman dismissed any concern about being overheard. The children were warned away from the steps. The ladies inside didn't like little boys. The second woman, with a snake's mouth, elaborated that the ladies caught boys and made them eat poison candy, that dozens had never been seen again. The other child asked about little girls, and the woman said they were hated too, but eaten rather than just captured. The first woman tried to stop the frightening stories, insisting they weren't true, but the second woman added that the ladies only came out at night, hunting children. The man finally said he did not want the children going near the house. Charles Blackwood returned only once, arriving in a car with another man late one afternoon. They had been watching for a long time, and all the strangers had gone. Her sister had just stirred and mentioned it was time to put on the potatoes when the car turned into the driveway, and she settled back to watch again. Charles and his companion got out in front of the house and walked directly to the foot of the steps, looking up, though they could not see inside. She remembered how Charles had stood exactly like that the first time he came, but this time he would never get in. She reached up and touched the lock on the front door to confirm it was fastened, and from the other side of the doorway her sister turned and nodded. She knew as well that Charles would never enter again. Outside, Charles gestured at the house, declaring it looked better than before now that the vines had grown, though the roof was gone and the inside gutted. His companion asked if the women were actually inside, and Charles laughed a laugh. She remembered, tied to his big staring white face, and from behind the door she wished him dead. He assured the man they were indeed inside, and so was a fortune. He described money that had never been counted, buried all over, a safe full, hidden in ways no one knew. They never came out, he said, just hid away with all that wealth. The other man asked if Charles was known to them, and Charles confirmed he was their cousin, had visited once. The man asked if there was any chance of getting one of them to speak, maybe appear at a window so he could get a picture. Charles considered, then asked if he would get half the payment if the story sold. The man promised. Charles told him to get behind the car and out of sight, since they would never come out if they saw a stranger. The man retrieved a camera and settled himself out of view. Charles started up the steps and called out to her sister, announcing he was back. She watched Constance and thought her sister had never seen Charles so clearly for what he was. He called again, and she knew her sister now understood he was a ghost and a demon, one of the strangers. He spoke in a pleasant, pleading tone, asking them to forget everything that had happened and be friends again. She could see his feet, one tapping restlessly on the porch floor. He went on, saying he didn't know what they had against him, that he had been waiting and waiting to be allowed back, and if he had offended them, he was truly sorry. She wished he could see them sitting on the floor on either side of the door, listening to him and looking at his feet while he begged the door 3 feet above their heads. He softened his voice, asking her sister to open the door for Cousin Charles. Her sister looked up toward where his face must be, and smiled unpleasantly, a smile she thought her sister had been saving for just this moment. Charles mentioned visiting the uncle's grave that morning, returning to see it, and to see her sister once more. He paused, his voice breaking slightly as he claimed to have placed flowers on the old man's grave, calling him a fine old guy who had always been good to him. Beyond Charles's feet, she saw the other man emerge from behind the car with his camera, calling out that Charles was wasting his breath and that he didn't have all day. Charles turned away from the door, his voice still strained, insisting he had to see her sister once more, that he had caused everything that had happened. The other man asked what he meant, and Charles asked why else 2 old maids would shut themselves up in a house like this, claiming he hadn't meant for things to turn out this way. She thought her sister might speak or laugh out loud, and she reached across to touch her arm, warning her to be quiet, but her sister didn't turn her head. Charles continued, suggesting the man could at least take pictures of the house with him standing there, knocking frantically at the door. The other man dismissed him, saying he could be stretched across the door sill dying of a broken heart for all he cared, and went to put his camera in the car, declaring it a waste of time. Charles called out loudly to her sister, begging her to open the door, but the other man from the car predicted he was never going to see those silver dollars again. Charles pleaded with her sister, saying she didn't know what she was doing to him, that he didn't deserve to be treated this way. The other man asked if he wanted to walk back to town, closing the car door. Charles turned away from the door, then turned back, delivering a final ultimatum. If he left this time, he would never return. He meant it, he insisted. The other man repeated that he was leaving. Charles started down the steps, speaking over his shoulder, telling them to take a last look, that he was going, and that one word could make him stay. She wasn't sure he would actually leave in time, and she honestly didn't know whether her sister could contain herself until he reached the car. He said goodbye from the foot of the steps, then turned and walked slowly toward the car, pausing as if to wipe his eyes, but the other man told him to hurry. Charles looked back once, raised his hand sadly, and got in. Then her sister laughed, and she laughed too, and for a moment she saw Charles in the car turn his head quickly, as though he had heard them, but the car started and drove away. They held each other in the dark hall, laughing until tears ran down their cheeks, the echoes rising up the ruined stairway to the sky. Her sister gasped that she was so happy, and she reminded her that she had promised she would like it on the moon. The Carringtons stopped one Sunday after church and sat in their car, looking at the house as if expecting the sisters to appear if there was anything they could do. She sometimes thought of the drawing room and dining room, sealed forever, their mother's lovely broken things scattered under a gentle settling of dust. New landmarks had emerged in the house, just as a new daily pattern had formed. The crooked remnant of the stairway was something they passed every day and came to know intimately. The boards across the kitchen windows were theirs, part of the house, and they loved them. They were very happy, though her sister lived in constant dread that one of their two cups might break, forcing someone to use a handleless one. They had their familiar places, their chairs at the table, their beds, their spots beside the front door. Her sister washed the red and white tablecloth and the uncle's shirt she wore, and while they dried in the garden, she wore a yellow bordered tablecloth that looked handsome with her gold belt. Their mother's old brown shoes were safely stored in her corner. In summer, she went barefoot like the cat. Her sister disliked picking many flowers, but a bowl of roses or daisies always sat on the kitchen table, never, of course, from the uncle's rose bush. She sometimes thought of her 6 blue marbles, but she was no longer allowed to go to the long field, and she considered that they had been buried to protect a house that no longer existed, having no connection to the house where they now lived so happily. Her new safeguards were the front door lock, the boarded windows, and the side barricades. In the evenings they sometimes saw movement in the darkness on the lawn and heard whispers, warnings about the ladies watching, questions about whether they could see in the dark, assurances that they saw everything. Laughter drifted through the warm night. Her sister predicted the place would soon be called Lover's Lane, and she agreed, adding that, after Charles, of course. Her sister mused that the least Charles could have done was shoot himself in the driveway. From listening, they learned that strangers could only see a great ruined structure overgrown with vines, barely recognizable as a house the midway point between village and highway. No one ever saw their eyes looking out through the vines. Children warned each other not to go on the steps, or the ladies would get them. Once a boy, dared by the others, stood at the foot of the steps, shivering and near tears, and called out shakily before fleeing. That night, they found a basket of fresh eggs and a note apologizing for him. Her sister pitied the child, imagining him hiding under his bed, while she suggested he might have received a good whipping. Her sister announced they would have an omelet for breakfast. She wondered if she could actually eat a child if given the chance, and her sister doubted she could cook one. She concluded that the poor strangers had so much to be afraid of. Her sister admitted that she was afraid of spiders. She promised that she and the cat would ensure no spider ever came near her, and then she declared with warmth that they were so happy. The end. And now the house grows quiet again. Thank you for staying here a little longer, for walking through these rooms, through the silences, through the shadows that Shirley Jackson left waiting between the walls. Stories like this only truly exist when someone listens, and for a while, you carried this one with you. We have always lived in the castle was born from places Shirley Jackson knew all too well. She lived with anxiety, with isolation, with a strange feeling of standing near people while somehow remaining outside of them. Living in North Bennington, Vermont, she experienced the small cruelties and quiet judgments of ordinary communities, and those feelings slowly drifted into her fiction. She understood something unsettling. People are often frightened by what they cannot understand, and fear can turn ordinary crowds into something far more dangerous. She didn't write monsters hiding beneath beds. She wrote the monsters that sit at dinner tables, smile politely, and live next door. Writing itself wasn't always easy for her. Between raising children and battling personal struggles, Jackson often wrote in fragments of stolen time. Yet from that chaos came works like The Haunting of Hill House and The Lottery stories that never needed loud horrors because they understood a quieter truth. Fear often arrives gently. And maybe that's why this story still lingers decades later. Beneath the mystery and unease, there is loneliness here, belonging, protection, and love twisted into shapes that no longer know where safety ends and destruction begins. Maricat builds tiny rituals in private worlds because sometimes people create their own magic when reality becomes too painful to bear. Years later, the story found its way onto the screen through Stacy Passan's adaptation. Passan approached the world less like a conventional thriller and more like a dream slowly drifting toward darkness. Mark Kruger adapted the screenplay, while Piers McGrail's cinematography gave the Blackwood estate a faded, haunted beauty, and Andrew Hewitt's score seemed to whisper around the edges rather than announce itself. Taissa Farmiga carried Maricat with a quiet unpredictability that made you feel you could never entirely read her thoughts. Alexandra Daddario brought warmth and fragility to Constance, while Crispin Glover's Uncle Julian felt almost ghost-like, as though he had been living with memories for so long that they had become more real than the present itself. Sebastian Stan's Charles arrived like a disturbance in still water. The film remained surprisingly close to Jackson's spirit, but some changes softened the novel's ambiguity and inner tension. Books can live inside thoughts. Films often have to place those feelings into faces, rooms, and silence. Certain psychological layers that Jackson left hidden beneath Maricat's voice had to be brought closer to the surface. The journey to adaptation took years. Michael Douglas's production company had been attached long before the film finally reached audiences. Filming took place in Ireland, where old landscapes and locations helped create that isolated atmosphere around the Blackwood home. Even small details mattered. Anna Rackard's production design and Imernie Hall O'Domney's costume work quietly reinforced the feeling that the Blackwoods existed slightly outside of time itself. And there is something fitting in that. Shirley Jackson's final novel became one of her most enduring works. Decades after its release, readers still argue over Maricat, still sympathize with her, still fear her, and sometimes do both at once. If this story stayed with you tonight, spend some time with the original novel too. There are certain feelings that only Shirley Jackson herself can place into words. Quiet thoughts that sit beside you long after the final page closes. And if this journey meant something to you, I'd love to hear what you carried away from it. Maybe you saw Maricat as tragic, maybe protective, maybe terrifying, maybe all of them at once. Share your thoughts, even the ones that disagree. Stories become larger when they continue through conversation. And if you'd like to return for more worlds like this, subscribing simply helps keep these journeys alive and helps these stories find someone else who may need them. For now, thank you for giving this story a place in your imagination. Because the strangest thing about old houses and old stories is that sometimes they never truly end. Sometimes they simply wait for someone to open the door again.